The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. Story 1. Why I never close any doors. All the doors in my house have been removed from the hinges, not counting the entrance, because that one is safe. I carry a doorstop with me at all times. When people ask me why I can't be around closed doors, I tell them it's crippling fear from an unprocessed trauma. In a sense, I'm not lying, but it's far from the truth. We carry so many heavy things on our conscience that it becomes a part of our persona. Life without that burden is impossible to imagine, but there comes a point in life when we have to drop the dead weight. Some people are lucky enough to do it early. Those people get to experience life to the fullest without that looming, dark cloud. Others, like me, hold on to their shackles, because there's beauty in the pain, because without it, we would be stripped of everything familiar, and we wouldn't even know who we are anymore. I hope what I'm about to share will bring me a semblance of a closure I've been seeking all these years. 20 years earlier, my dad got a job offer that forced our family to move to Woodbury, Oregon. For a teenager accustomed to the vibrant city life of Portland, this was a jarring shift. I was too young and too absorbed in my own world in order to appreciate the vast expanse of firs and pines cascading over the roiling hills, the tranquility nature's embrace offered, and the warmth and camaraderie of small communities. I still remember how hot that May morning was when we arrived in front of our new home. I recall my parents marveling at the house, talking about life in the town with optimism. Some neighbors had come by to introduce themselves to my parents. Just like every bitter teen, I entered the house and climbed upstairs into what I hoped would become my room once we settled. For the next 15 minutes, the reality of my new life was starting to dawn on me with a crushing weight, with no proper way to keep in touch. It wouldn't be long before my friends forget about me. That's life, I guess. When we're young, every upheaval feels like the end of the world. If only we knew back then how easy we had it. Friendships blossomed from shared glances, cool toys, or the coincidence of being in the same place. As we grow older, those friendships transform into something with layers of depth. It's no longer just about having fun in the moment. It's about existential crises and finding answers to life's big questions. That is where paths often diverge. At that crossroads where the broad meets the specific, we often come to a realization that it's not always a falling out that ends friendships. More often than not, it's the steady march of life pulling us apart. Sometimes, people change. That brings me back to Woodbury. My contemplation was interrupted when my mom called me downstairs to meet the new neighbors. Grouching, I stamped to the front door, expecting an elderly woman carrying a tray of mint cookies or a married couple from across the street, flashing taut grins. Instead, I was met with a boy and a girl my age. An unexpected surprise. "Hi," the girl said. "I'm Nicole." She was a pretty thing. Big, ocean-colored eyes. That was the first thing I noticed about her. Short, and with ginger hair tied into a ponytail. The way she incessantly stared at me in fascination suggested that new faces in the neighborhood were a novelty. The lanky boy next to her might have shared in her enthusiasm, but the long bangs partially covering his face made it difficult to tell. His back slouched, perhaps to reach the pockets of the sagging pants his hands were buried into, and when he spoke up, he did so with a deep and resonant voice that belied his slender frame. "Hey, James, we live nearby." He hooked a thumb in a general direction down the street. For a moment, he straightened his back and squared his shoulders, as if following an echo of a reminder, perhaps an adult reprimanding him for his improper posture. "Hi," that was all I could manage. I didn't like those pairs of eyes plastered to me. I felt like an animal at the zoo, there for entertainment of these two visitors. My mom must have sensed my hesitation, because she put a hand on my shoulder and did the introduction for me. "This is Chris. We just moved here from Portland," she said. Heat rushed into my face. I felt embarrassed in front of the two people that could potentially become my new and possibly only friends in Woodbury, and my tongue refused to cooperate. "Cool," James said. "Nice to meet you." Nicole smiled. When she did so, she revealed a row of crooked teeth, crooked in a cute way. Even with my dad talking to the neighbor, that awfully resembled a typical suburban dad as the background noise. The silence that stretched between me, Nicole, and James was awkward. Eventually, it was Nicole who broke the silence. "We were going to go down this trail just outside the neighborhood. There's a cool hangout spot. Wanna come?" My initial instinct was to look at my mom for approval, but I resisted it, because I didn't want to score any extra negative points in the first impression. "Sure, fuck it. Let's do it," I said in a rare display of profanity in front of her. I then looked at her. The round of chiding I expected for the cussing didn't come, but I could see her lips tightening into an ephemeral grimace. Just enough to tell me, "You're lucky your friends are here. Be home by dinner," she said instead. James pulled his hands out of his pockets and led the way. He took long, stalk-like steps, dragging his already dirty pant legs across the ground. I remember thinking how my mum never would have allowed me to ruin a pair of pants like that, just for the sake of looking cool. But I also envied James for that apparent freedom. For the first few minutes of walking, we didn't speak, and the air was tense with that silence, as if all three of us were thinking of how to start a conversation without being too corny about it. "So, what's life like here?" By the time I realized how stupid that question sounded, the words had already left my mouth. "Boring," Nicole said. "It has its perks," James said. "I thought everybody wanted to leave the small town eventually." I raised an eyebrow. "Move somewhere bigger." "Everyone normal," Nicole said. "I can't wait to graduate and leave this shithole." "Where do you plan to go?" I asked. "I don't know. Somewhere big, a place where nobody would know me, where I could make a fool of myself in a crowded place and not worry about the whole town knowing about it for the rest of my life." It sounded as if Nicole was speaking from experience, either hers or someone else's. "Oh, come on. Woodbury is not like that," James said. Nicole gave him a look. "Ms. Coates is still known as the Cat Lady." "So?" "She's been dead for 20 years. It's a pretty distinct title." "Well, it wouldn't be in a big city. Over there, you could do whatever you want and be whatever you want, and no one would even look in your direction. And you know why? Because people don't care over there. They have their own busy lives, and there are far too many cat ladies for them to pay attention. Right, Chris?" She spun, waiting for me to chime in. I couldn't really tell, because Nicole was giving me perspective on something I had known all my life. To someone who believed since early childhood the sky was blue, anything opposite seemed outlandish. I had grown up in a city, and that made me desensitized to the benefits of privacy and opportunity it offered. "Living in a small town has its perks," James repeated. "Oh yeah? Name some," Nicole insisted. "There's safety in it. You know everybody and everybody knows you. You know you can count on your neighbors. It's a real community, not a traffic-jammed rat maze packed with people who are dead inside, slaving away from morning to dusk for their corporate overlords." "Would you rather work at the local movie theater for the rest of your life?" Nicole asked. "I'd rather trade the extra money for some peace and quiet. I mean, listen." He stopped and raised a finger. Nicole and I stopped abruptly. "Two. You hear that?" Gentle swaying of trees in the wind. In the distance, the migration of a car's engine, an occasional chirp from the canopies. I had never lived in a neighborhood as serene as this one. Police and ambulance sirens were my lullabies and white noise. This silence was unnerving. It carried too much emptiness, too much room for pondering. I assumed that the abyssal vacuum would only amplify with the arrival of night, especially in the quiet hours while trying to sleep. That was when the body relaxed and the mind went to work, filling the blanks with a compilation of all the embarrassing moments that made us question our competence as a human being. It's too quiet. How do people even fall asleep when it's like this? I asked. You'll get used to it after a while, James said. If it meant I would be lulled into this monotony of a life, then I didn't want to get used to it. We continued walking to the edge of the woods, presumably marking the border of the neighborhood. I looked back toward my new house. I could still see my dad in front, but as a distant, imperceptible figure. You coming? James asked. I turned my head toward them to see them standing at the beginning of the trail. Where are we going? I asked. It's a cool hangout spot. You'll see, Nicole said. She must have noticed my reluctance, because she said, we'll get you home before dinner. Promise. Another pang of embarrassment, which I promptly suppressed. I had already made a decision that I wanted to be a part of James and Nicole's gang. And for that to happen, I had to be cool, not lame. The trail meandered between encroaching trees, their dense foliage forming a natural parasol above us. Dry branches cracked under our shoes, the echo sharp and satisfying in the stillness of the air. Occasionally, something small skittered through the underbrush. It was an entirely different world here, quiet, but not in the same way. The farther we treaded, the more apparent that became, because this wasn't a typical trail used for hiking. There were no signs of frequent activities here, just the thin, battered path we followed in line between the weaving trees. This forest belonged to the teens, not the adults. It was our domain, sanctuary away from prying eyes where we were the rulers. I said we because I already felt like I was a part of the inner sanctum Nicole and James had formed. At some point, James stopped. He pointed off the trail to his left and said, "This way." "Where are we going?" I asked again, a flicker of uncertainty urging me to go back. "It's cooler if we show you," Nicole said. She gestured to the rock sitting in the grass. "This is the first landmark. Remember it." She was talking like I would be coming here more often. In that moment, I knew I would, if not for the repose this place offered. Then for Nicole, if those blue eyes weren't enough to convince me, then the smile was. Never underestimate a teenager's hormones. We trekked through the tall stalks of grass for a few minutes until we reached a clearing. In the midst of the ground stood an opening descending into inky blackness. "What's that?" I asked. James was already descending the ladder attached to the hole. Nicole gave me a reassuring look. "It'll be worth it. Trust me." She went down next, left alone in the open sky. I approached the aperture and peered down. I could just vaguely make out two silhouettes shifting in the darkness. "Come on," James's voice came out as tinny. I put my foot on the first rung. The ladder squealed in protest. The whole thing was rusted, jangled with each step I took, the reek of an imminent injury, or worse, looming right above me, gnawing at the nape of my neck. Pretty soon, I was plunged into darkness. All I had as orientation was the daylight that poured in from above. Daring to look down, thick darkness seemed to congeal at my feet. "You're almost here," Nicole said, her voice sounding both close and far at the same time. It was the boost I needed. Somehow, my eyes adjusted to the dark by the time I reached the bottom. When my feet touched the slick surface of the ground, I said a silent prayer for not slipping and breaking my ankle. Nicole was staring at me with a complacent smile. James, on the other hand, was fiddling with something by a wall I couldn't see. Moments later, a spear of light cut through the darkness. He swept the flashlight directly across my eyes, momentarily blinding me. "This way," he said, bounding down the tunnel, which I hadn't seen was there until then. "Wow," I said. My voice sounded amplified in the enclosed space, giving the familiar daylight above me one final glance. I went after my companions through the tunnel. My shoes splashed across the shallow puddles. Twice, I held out a hand for support on the nearby wall, only to have my fingers come off slick with grime. My trepidation was kept in check by my fascination with this place. How often does a teen get to explore a tunnel? Does anyone else know about place? I asked. Nope, just me and Nicole, James said from the front. I'm amazed no one has discovered this yet. Both Nicole and James became just an octave quiet, and it was then that I knew I had said something I shouldn't have. Nicole craned her neck toward me. We had a friend. He's the one who discovered this place. What happened to him? I asked, even though I knew I shouldn't have. A moment of pause lingered between us, as if Nicole and James were trying to decide who should be the one to tell me. He left Woodbury, James said. I think his parents got a new job or something. There was resentment in his voice, maybe even anger, toward that unnamed friend. Nicole's demeanor, on the other hand, betrayed. Was it hurt? Didn't he tell you why he needed to leave? I asked. It all happened in a hurry, Nicole said. Hey, it doesn't matter. Andrew's gone. But we're still here, James said, but the pitch of his voice was just a little too high. We must have been walking for 20 minutes before we reached another ladder. This one ascended into blackness. James climbed first. Nicole and I watched the cone of his flashlight bobbing farther and farther up. When he was at the top, a loud, metallic groan shrieked through the air. Then James pointed his light down and said, "Okay. You want to go first?" Nicole asked. I nodded. This ladder was firmer in place, albeit equally rusty, and with a missing rung that James had warned me about just before I missed the invisible step. When I reached the top, he helped hoist me up. He harbored a lot of strength for someone as bony. Thanks, I said. Nicole joined in seconds later. I took in my surroundings. The first thing I became too aware of was the sour smell that came with old places. Swaths of old, faded wallpaper peeled to reveal plaster. Cobweb clung to the corners of the ceiling. Wherever sunlight peered through the cracks, dust gyrated in erratic manner. Where are we? I asked. It's an abandoned house, James said. He bent down and closed the hatch. The hinges produced another ancient caterwall before the lid slammed shut. James turned off the flashlight. Despite the boarded-up windows, there was sufficient light to navigate the house without a torch. Come on, we'll give you a tour around the place, Nicole said. The rest of the house was in an equally ramshackle state. Heavy patinas of dust clung to furniture. Tables, banisters, shelves, and other surfaces, a testament of their abandonment. In places, the wood flooring had risen, sloping bumps, slanting and toppling furniture. Doors were left ajar, perpetually stuck by the floor that stopped them from moving. On the lower floor, a living room sprawled in grandeur, its walls adorned with framed pictures of nature. A broken TV sat like a forgotten relic, an antique coffee table in front of it, marred by time. The kitchen floor, once pristine linoleum, now betrayed its age with the edges that curled like corners of an old map. James and Nicole led me upstairs. The trail of swept dust showed which parts of the house they used frequently. We just briefly peered into an office where a formidable oak desk dominated with its presence. Behind it, the shelves stacked with tattered books whistled their neglect. The bedroom revealed a concave floor. We were about to turn into a room on the left, when I noticed a closed door at the end of the corridor. It was the obtrusive manner in which it stood that caught my attention. A simple, sturdy door beckoning me to come closer, twist the knob, and discover the secrets within. Hey, what's over there? I asked. Oh, Nicole gave it an aloof glance. We'll get to that later. Come on. I couldn't pry my gaze away from that door. A gravitational force pulled my consciousness toward it, strumming the strings of curiosity in my head. The corners of my vision narrowed, hyper-focusing on that door, and somehow I felt myself drawing nearer to it, so near that I could see the round knob. I could feel the cold of it in my hand. could sense the resistance it offered as I twisted. Chris, James's voice snapped my attention back to the real world. I was still rooted to the spot where I had stood, next to the empty room. Ignoring the closed door at the end of the corridor, we entered the empty room, but at a vaguely conscious level, I could hear the door calling to me. Bottles and cans of beer, crushed cigarette packs, and candy wrappers littered the floor. I approached the window and peered outside. Tall grass surrounded the house. From what I could tell from the other windows, there was no good way to approach the property. That, coupled with the fact that the house was in the middle of the woods, made for a perfect refuge for rebellious teens. Okay, not gonna lie, this is pretty cool, I said. Right? Nicole asked. We often come here to chill out after school, James said. Whose house is this? James shrugged. Who the fuck knows? It's been here longer than we have. I spun to scan the room. A Polaroid was tacked to the wall. Curious. I inspected it. A young man with a stuck-out tongue held one arm around Nicole, the other around James, who presumably held the camera to take a picture of them. Nicole was laughing, drawn close by the man's embrace. Is that him? I asked. Yeah, there was a hint of somberness in Nicole's voice. That's Andrew. The fingers of the hand which he had around Nicole were adorned with garish rings. I noted a skull on his ring finger. The rest were indiscernible. It was a timeless moment that would never repeat. Three friends, oblivious to the past or the future, just living in the moment for that rush of dopamine that each other's presence gave them. Looking at the picture made me sad on Nicole and James's behalf. There were still too many unspoken things about Andrew, things they weren't ready to share. The despondency that had suddenly appeared in the air alluded to that. So, the house. You said no one else knows about it? I asked. Nicole shook her head. Nope. And speaking of that, now that you do know about it, it means you're part of our gang, whether you like it or not. Before the warmth of welcoming could snuggle up to my chest properly, James said, and being a part of our gang means you need to follow a few strict rules. They were both staring at me, waiting for my approval so they could recite the terms and conditions. I nodded. Once. Rule number 1, you never tell anyone about this place. Never, James said. You can come here all you like with us or alone, but you never ever show it to anyone. Why? Because the word's going to spread, and that means the entire house is going to become like this room. He gestured to the trash. Fair enough, I said. That brings me to rule 2, James said. This is the hangout room. No trash in the rest of the house. Got it? Another nod. Okay, and rule number 3. He paused, probed me with his gaze. My eyes flitted from James to Nicole. They both had the most grievous looks on their faces. What? I asked. We don't ever open that door, James said. The flat tone made me think they were playing with me. I let out a chuckle, but it was dry, unconvincing. They didn't laugh. You're serious? I asked. Yes, Nicole said, confirming James's rule. We don't ever open that door. Why? We just don't. What's behind it? We don't know. It's been closed ever since Andrew found it. He's the one who made the rule. We're just following the original laws. I scratched my head. Don't you think he might have been messing with you? I tried to evoke laughter out of them. It didn't work, because there was nothing humorous about this situation, apparently.
We're serious.
Chris, Nicole, who had been amicable this entire time, said, confirming that this was indeed serious. That's the most important rule. We can tolerate breaking rules 1 and 2 in some rare cases, but 3 will get you an instant ban from this place. Permanently, James added. I didn't understand what the fuss was all about, nor did I care too much about it at that moment, because the mystery of the door was overshadowed by the excitement of finding an underground tunnel leading to an abandoned house in the middle of the forest. Okay, deal, I said, because not opening the door was a small price to pay to be in the cool kids club. Over the next few months, I adjusted to my life in Woodbury. I started going to school, met some friends, but I mostly hung out with James and Nicole. Every day after school, we would go to the house and stay there sometimes until late evening. The house breathed a different aura with the fall of night. The exterior grew in volume, but the house itself seemed to sink into slumber. At moments, it felt wrong to speak too loudly so as to not disturb the silence that permeated the air. Other times, I felt like we could scream at the top of our lungs and no one would bother to shut us up. That unbridled freedom was refreshing for someone living under the tyranny of their parents. Only one thing remained constant and unchanged about the house. The door at the end of the hallway stood stalwart, an inanimate object that fluctuated with strange sentience in moments of utter silence. While inside the house, we would have fun, and then out of nowhere, the mood would seem to drop out of nowhere, just for a second. Always just for a second. Enough for all three of us to share a silent glance, but never voice what that viscousness in the air meant. In those moments, my mind would inadvertently be drawn to the door with unrestrained curiosity. A nagging voice would rationalize why it was okay to open the door, that there was nothing there, that we were elevating our own temptation and giving that room more power than it had. But then that inkling would disappear just as quickly as it had arrived, and we would go back to talking and laughing. I learned a lot about my friends. James's dad wanted him to take over his car repair shop, but he wasn't interested in cars. He wanted to become a video game developer someday. People are going to work remotely in the future. He kept saying, "We are all going to have computers at home," he said. Nicole and I had a lot of fun taking jabs at him for that. Once Nicole opened up, I learned that there was a lot more to her than the jovial mask she put on her face. She came from a troubled family. Her mom left when she was young, and her dad hardly paid attention to her unless he needed her to fetch him a beer. For her, home was hell, so she sought an escape at school and at the abandoned house. The house was the only place where she could truly be herself, she said. She often mentioned Andrew. There was a sort of melancholy to her words, but also fondness. At times, she spoke about him highly, an embalmed description that couldn't possibly be true. Other times, the underlying grudge toward his disappearance became obvious. I never asked if the two of them had been more than just friends. I just sort of put two and two together. After all, people don't reveal the most about themselves through their storytelling. They reveal it between lines of seemingly innocent sentences. And sometimes, when she didn't know I was looking, she would assume this pensive gaze when she was staring at the group photo on the wall, like she was trying hard to remember something from the past, something that would shed light on a mystery that kept plaguing her mind. Or perhaps she was simply reminiscing the good times with bittersweet dejection. Either way, that scarring made her more beautiful in my eyes. It made me see past the superficial beauty, past the ossified shell she'd erected around herself, and made me appreciate her more for who she was. All our lives, we're told to strive for perfection, but in truth, it's the flaws that make us beautiful. Those imperfections tell the story of our resilience in the face of adversity. Each blemish is a testament of our strength, a crack from which something beautiful can blossom. I remember it clearly. It was a cold September night when it all changed. I remember it because it was the last time I ever felt truly happy before my innocence was irrevocably stripped away. Nicole, James, and I had been chilling in the room designated for trash, just as we had been doing for the past few months. We had been drinking a little more than we planned. I wasn't drunk, but I was past the point of no return about managing to convince my parents I was sober. With that in mind, I figured I might as well go the extra mile. I don't remember what conversations we were having. That's what bothers me the most. For the past 20 years, I've been trying to recall in an attempt to regain a semblance of that innocence I had lost. But it just wasn't coming to me. People usually remembered the endings the most vividly, don't they? So why couldn't I remember? Because that wasn't the ending for me. It was only about to come. I can't remember what we had been laughing about, but what I do remember is Nicole stopping, as if a foreign thought had just occurred to her. "I miss Andrew," she said. Both James and I went quiet, because we both knew we had reached a new milestone in our friendship with Nicole. She'd never dared to voice her emotions toward Andrew up until then, to open up about the scar that obviously hadn't healed even after all this time. But the booze must have been loosening her tongue. We, as humans, don't deal well with mysteries. We need to believe there's a reason for everything in life, that God is cruel, that the universe has a plan for us, that it's fate, destiny, anything but the infinity of question marks looming millions of light years away, and yet staying in the vicinity for us to wonder. "Me too," James said, because what more was there to say? I looked down at the bottle of beer in my hand, spun it absent-mindedly. The remainder of the liquid sloshed inside. When I looked up at Nicole, her gaze was glued to the photo on the wall. She must have noticed me watching her, because she straightened her back and brushed the whole thing off with a smile. "Sorry, I didn't mean to kill the mood," she said. "No, you didn't," both James and I said, but I doubt we sounded convincing to Nicole. Nicole's eyes begged for a warm touch, a shoulder to cry on. I wanted to scoot up to her, embrace her in a tight hug, stroke her back, tell her everything was going to be okay. But I couldn't know that, could I? As I stood there weighing whether to make the bold move of comforting her, she hopped to her feet. "I'm going to use the bathroom. Be right back." The moment had passed. I could be wrong, but I thought I detected a glint in her eyes. Before I could take a better look, she bolted out of the room with stampeding footsteps. James and I sat in silence. Then I excused myself to go to the bathroom, too. I still can't remember to this day whether I had intended on going after Nicole or using the bathroom. I like to think it was the former. It's easier to deal with my cowardice that way. As I exited into the corridor, I felt that familiar burning shame that had enveloped me on the first day when I met Nicole and James. Something screamed at me to go after her, to get close to her like I wanted to. And perhaps if I had, everything in my life would have gone differently. But that voice was quickly drowned out by something that bubbled from the lowest depths of my consciousness to a boiling point. My gaze was inexplicably drawn to the door at the end of the hallway. I tried to look away, but it was a futile fight against the river currents. Maybe it was the alcohol that had sapped my willpower. Maybe I was just fed up with the curiosity. All I knew was my feet were moving on their own toward the door. Each step I took felt like sinking deeper and deeper into muck I would not be able to get out of. This was the closest I'd been to the door, and the farthest to safety. I somehow knew that on an unconscious level, but my body was doing nothing to stop it. Then, I was in front of the door, staring down at the brass knob, my hand languidly hovering in front of it. Then, my fingers closed around it. Something inside of me screamed, but once again, I was powerless to stop it. And then, with a motion that felt like it lasted for an eternity, I twisted the knob, and twisted, and twisted. Behind me, I heard a scream, an effeminate no or don't. I couldn't tell. By then, the door was swinging inward. A squeak that had not been heard in perhaps decades revealed darkness beyond the threshold. A patter of footsteps ran up to me. Before I knew what was going on, firm hands clutched my shoulders, shaking me violently. I vaguely registered James yelling so loudly that spittle flew in my face. But I didn't hear anything he said. I couldn't pry my eyes away from the dark room, because something in there had caught my attention. An effervescent sound that caused James to shut up. A shuffle. A moan. A moan. It was a sewage-like sound. Something that would come from someone with a tube stuck down their throat. The solitary noise was joined by an orchestra of similar sounds, swelling from the darkness to a crescendo. I must have backpedaled from the door, because I suddenly realized I was standing farther away from it than James. I stared with an unblinking gaze at that roiling darkness, waiting for the source of the noise to come into light. And then it did. From the murky abyss, a hand emerged, masculine, with thick fingers and a forearm cloaked in coarse hair. It gripped the edge of the doorframe, fingers straining until the tips turned white. Then another hand, this one near the bottom, and then my mind struggled to comprehend the abject horror unfolding in front of me. A taut wall of skin filled the doorframe, pressed against it, occupying the entire length. Countless eyes darted in every direction, never settling, ravenously exploring the space beyond their confinement. Mouths, twisted in every conceivable direction, horizontal, vertical, slanted, moved like fish out of water, uttering no words, only emitting those dreadful sounds of agony. Hands groped the air, fingers constricting and extending too stiffly, like joints that hadn't been used in a long time. The fleshy abomination couldn't fit through the door, but it was persisting nonetheless. The hands pulled its colossal form in vain. The entire time, James was standing there, staring in awe. The panic that had been inflating my chest finally unspooled, and I let out a cry at the top of my lungs. "James!" By then, it was already too late. A hand that had been seemingly flailing in the air without a purpose gripped James by the wrist. His eyes grew wide just in time when fingers groped him, tugging at his hair, his shirt, ankles. He didn't scream, even when the hands reeled him onto the flesh wall. His shoulders twitched with a futile effort to break free of their vice-like grip. But it was no use. His mouth opened, the muscles in his neck strained with a scream that was drowned out by the moans that now filled the entirety of the corridor. In a last desperate attempt, James's eyes locked with mine, a silent plea to help. Please, God, help. But even as I contemplated between the act of heroism and flight, that abhorrent thing was spilling out, shaping itself around the doorframe and the wall. I couldn't stand to look at James's expression of utter fear mixed with judgment. This was all too much for me to handle. I spun on my heel and jackknifed into a dash. I bounded down the stairs, skipping 2 at a time, almost tripping along the way. At the bottom, I bumped into Nicole, hard. "What gives?" she asked. "We gotta go." I think I managed to say that, or at least I tried to, more likely than not. The words that left my mouth were a garbled string of caveman sounds. She narrowed her eyes at me, then looked upstairs. "Where's James?" I could see the intention in her eyes. Before she took a step up, I grabbed her by the wrist. "No, no, no, don't go there. We have to..." A moan erupted at the top of the stairs. Too close, too fast. Nicole looked at me with a quizzical expression. Then up. She jerked her hand free and ran upstairs, screaming James's name. She stopped a few steps short of reaching the upper floor. The fight drained from her. From here, I could see the shape of that thing, bloating with each pulse, devouring the space of the house. I would never know what went through Nicole's mind as she stared at those hands inching closer to her. Disbelief, horror. By the time she broke out of her stupor, the thing was close, far too close. Nicole screamed, spun around, but she didn't make it more than a step forward before face-planting the stairs. A hand latched onto her ankle, another on her calf. For a moment, she was dazed, but when she realized what was going on, she let out a shrill cry. It didn't matter that she clawed at the steps. It didn't matter that she cried and screamed please over and over as the flesh embraced her in a motherly hug. It didn't matter that she looked at me with the same pleading eyes as James. In the end, I was a coward. I ran. I ran into the room with the hatch. I threw it open, started down the ladder, and closed the entrance above me just in time to see the indeterminate light at the stairs blotted out, followed by a scream, this one feminine but muffled, the sound of a person gagging, a familiar sound that would haunt me for many nights in the years to come. I descended the ladder too fast and ended up slipping and falling down the last few rungs. If I hurt myself, then the adrenaline that poured into my bloodstream like liquid concrete prevented me from feeling it. I stumbled through the dark tunnel, blind, disoriented, my panting breaths echoing back. That thing was right above me. I could sense it. I couldn't see it, but it could see me. Even through the walls, I could sense those numerous eyes boring into me, following me voraciously. I didn't stop when I reached the other side of the tunnel. I didn't stop when I climbed out just in time to hear a distant, winding scream that trailed from the other end of the tunnel to me. Only when my lungs felt like they were on fire and my legs full of lead, and when the acidic bile climbed up my throat, did I reach a halt. I leaned on my knees, vomited 2 projectiles of puke, my knees threatening to buckle under my weight. By then, I could no longer sense that thing from the house. I stumbled the rest of the way home. My mom was in the living room, awake and ready to give me a round of scolding. It didn't take her long to notice something was wrong, and by then, I'd broken down crying. The police were called. They didn't manage to string too much coherence out of me, just the location I pointed them to. Less than an hour later, they returned to let me know that the tunnel I was referring to had completely caved, making traversal impossible. It looked like it had been like that for a while. There was no house in the woods anywhere close to Woodbury. According to them, I was the prime suspect for a while, but with insufficient evidence to convict me, I walked free, my stories dismissed as the ravings of a deranged teenager. By then, Woodbury was clad in a veil of black. The rescue had turned into a body recovery, and then ultimately ceased entirely. The perkiness in the streets was gone. Memorials and tributes were erected all over Woodbury. The hauntingly happy faces of Nicole and James staring at me wherever I went. I became the black sheep of the town. Everyone stared at me with hateful eyes, but never actually said anything aloud. That suggestive nature was driving me crazy. Sometimes, I wished they would come out and point fingers at me, punch me in the face, call me a murderer, because that's what I am. It didn't matter that I didn't deliver the killing blow. My parents weren't spared of the shunning either. Not long after that, we moved back to Portland with our tails between our legs. As far as Woodbury folks were concerned, good riddance. My parents never looked at me the same way. They tried to believe me. They really did. But the human mind can bend to adapt to the illogical only to a certain extent. If they weren't looking at me like I was a criminal, there was pity in their eyes. I don't know which I hated more. Years later, I tried various methods of therapy to get to the bottom of what happened that night, without any actual results. No one could solve my problem because no one believed me. Meds didn't help, and the glowers I earned from both experts and people I tried to make friends with helped me learn that it was better to not open up about my trauma at all. I haven't been able to look at a door the same way since then. No matter how hard I try to forget, that night follows me everywhere I go. A subtle reminder that invokes all the memories, forcing me to relive them all over again, sometimes with terrifying vividness. Lately, I've been hearing it a lot, in the quietest hours just before I drift to sleep. The tortured sound that jolts me wide awake in cold perspiration. Sometimes, it's that moan. Sometimes, it's an agonizingly familiar scream pushed to the forefront of the fleshy mass. A taunting gesture to remind me of my cowardice. Sometimes, it's a conglomerate of voices all screaming in their own individual suffering. Whatever was trapped in that house has finally reached me. I ran that night. I've been running since. But I'm tired of running. Nicole and James are coming after me, and I can feel their unfiltered drive for revenge, fueled by the colossal hatred of the countless bodies trapped in the amalgamation. Sometimes, as I dream, I can see that wall of skin. It's encompassing the entire world, surrounding me in every direction. Nicole and James's faces are on that architecture of flesh. They're stretched to impossible lengths, staring at me, screaming at me with the anguish of people suffering for an eternity. Hands are reaching toward me, hungrily clawing at the air for their next prey. Just before the fingers graze my face and I wake up, I see what I saw that night at the house just before closing the hatch. A glimpse of a skull-shaped ring digging into the constricted finger. Maybe they're together now, in some kind of twisted unison. Maybe they've become one. Story 2. I found an endless hole on some land I recently bought. It changes anything I send down in bizarre ways. I recently bought some land and a small cabin on the outskirts of Frost Hollow. The town had been in decline for decades. A constant stream of businesses and people left Frost Hollow every year. I heard rumors about high missing persons rates, as well as insane homicide and suicide rates that plagued the town constantly. This didn't bother me in the least. However, in my mind, it just meant the land there was dirt cheap, and that I wouldn't have too many neighbors to worry about. My closest neighbor, Art, was a sheep farmer, an ancient man with a cantankerous voice and a back like a broken board. He stood only about 5 feet tall, always wearing his trademark blue coveralls and a wide-brim hat. When I first found the hole, I tried shining a light down and then throwing heavy rocks inside, when only silence greeted me after a minute. I quickly realized that neither method would help me realize the depth of the hole. I immediately went over to Art's ranch house. Art had lived in Frost Hollow his whole life, and I figured if anyone would know about the pit, he would. Sheep milled about on the grassy fields around his house, meditatively chewing as they slowly ambled forward. Art and I both lived on top of the same hill, on a spot cleared of trees and brush about 1/10 of a mile across on the peak. My dog, Peaches, ran by my side, her mouth wide open in excitement and dripping with silver streams of saliva. I saw Art sitting on his porch of his weather-worn home, smoking a pipe and staring out across the field. His eyes ratcheted to me when the rickety porch steps groaned in protest under my weight. All of the paint had long ago peeled off the walls and shutters of his ancient home. "Joshua," he said in a thick drawl, "how are you settling in?" He took another long drag from the pipe. Smoke wreathed his face and white beard. He reminded me of a thin, diminutive Santa Claus. "It's very interesting," I admitted. The cabin still had books and trinkets left behind from the previous owner. It seemed like whoever it was had left in a hurry. I was happy to find leather-bound hardcover works by Robert Browning, T.S. Eliot and others when I first purveyed the bookshelves. But I'm really wondering about the hole, the one with the retaining wall around it. What is it? I figured it wasn't a well, for this hole was about 10 feet across and seemed to go down for at least 400 or 500 feet. The top of it was ringed by a perfectly circular stone wall a few feet high, presumably to keep people or animals from falling in by accident. If I knew that, I would be a wise man. Indeed, Art whispered sagely. That hole has been there for as long as anyone knows, before the town was even started. It doesn't seem to have any bottom that we can see. A few people who live around here have used to get rid of their trash for decades. We just throw whatever rubbish we have into the hole and voila, it's gone forever. Though my wife never trusted it, at least before she died. Maria always asked me not to go near it. I frowned. Art rarely talked about his dead wife. I knew she had passed away a few years earlier, but he refused to share any of the details of her death. That could potentially poison the groundwater. I said, "I'd like to ask you to stop throwing trash in the hole until I can get it looked at." I think Maria may have been right to be leery about abusing the pit. Art leaned forward, his eyes twinkling. "Sonny, wells around here never go below 200 or 300 feet. I can guarantee you that pit is neither a well in any conventional sense, nor connected to the underground reservoirs. As far as we've been able to tell, the walls are solid all the way down. They turn into some sort of glassy sandstone, and they go deep, at least a few thousand feet down." "How do you know all this?" I asked, curious. "Have you been studying it?" His expression brightened at this. "The previous owner of your cabin, Mel, asked me and a couple others to come over. This was back around 2001, I guess the first time I saw it. We did a few experiments, ran some lines to try to see how far down it went. We never did figure out where the bottom was, if it even has a bottom, but there were other weird effects from sending things down," Art said. "Like what?" I asked. He winked at me. "Meet me there in an hour, at sunset, and I'll show you," he said. I woke Peaches up and headed back to my cabin. She barked excitedly by my side, running circles around me playfully. I went to the hole early, watching and waiting as night descended. In the cloudless sky, the stars came out one by one, faintly twinkling like broken glass. I must have gotten lost in a trance, because the next thing I knew, Art was putting a small, bird-like hand on my shoulder. His ancient fingers trembled nervously, though I didn't know why. I saw him carrying a threadbare canvas bag around his shoulder. With a grunt, he put it down on the black earth surrounding the stone walls of the hole. I had left Peaches outside to run around and tire herself out. "What's all this?" I asked, feeling a creeping suspicion rise up my spine. Art gave his inscrutable Santa Claus smile, pulling his dirty pipe out of a pocket and lighting it. "You'll see," he said, pulling a long, heavy rope out of the bag. At the end, it was tied to a closed wicker basket. He kept reaching into the canvas bag, and his hand came up with a plastic grocery bag filled to the brim with ice. It had been tied and knotted. He looked back at me as he gingerly lowered the ice into the wicker basket. "You wanted to know what the hole is?" he asked, handing me the rope. "Let this basket drop down as far as the rope will go, and maybe you'll see for yourself." Together, we lowered the basket down into the hole. The darkness swallowed it instantly like a hungry mouth. I wondered what kind of game Art was playing. I figured that, by the time we raised it, we would have a basket filled with melted ice and nothing more. "It doesn't always work, you understand," Art said. "But when it does, well, it's one of the goddamn strangest things I've ever seen." We reached the end of the rope, let the basket hang for a few seconds, and then started pulling it back up. The whole process took a couple minutes. "You know there are dozens of types of ice?" Art asked as we struggled with the rope. "Some kinds of ice are burning hot and will scald your flesh from your bones. Others are as hard as steel and as cold as liquid nitrogen. Bizarre, huh? On Earth, we don't really see them, but on other planets, under high pressure, ice can take some truly alien forms." I watched the basket rise out of the shadows, appearing suddenly as if it had broken through the surface of a dark ocean. There seemed to be a light coming from inside of it. Carefully, we pulled it out and laid it next to the stone wall. "Go ahead," Art said, sitting down on the wall's ledge with a huff. It gave me vertigo just seeing him there, on the edge of an abyss that stretched thousands of feet. Art apparently had no fear of heights. However, he pulled out his pipe and lit a match. "Well, what are you waiting for? You wanted answers. Open it up and see for yourself." I knelt down next to the wicker basket. I inhaled deeply as I raised one of the covers, flipping it over in a heartbeat. I stared down in amazement at what I saw. The ice cubes were all still in their original shape, but now they looked like they were burning with an inner fire. Orange light flickered from the insides of them, twisting and spiraling in tiny cyclones. I saw they had totally melted the plastic bag, and by this point were starting to leave scorch marks on the wicker. Black smoke rose from the basket. Art stepped forward, taking a gnarled old hand and flipping the basket over before the burning ice could ignite the material. "What is it?" I asked, backing away from the ice cubes. Art shrugged, getting up with a creaking of bones and a heavy groan. "To be honest, Joshua, I can't give you all the answers," he said. "The story with the hole is long and very weird. We don't know where it came from or why it does what it does. Mel and I experimented with it for years. He even tried sending live animals down there." Art's wrinkled face seemed to go pale at the memory. "What happened when he sent an animal down there?" I asked, intensely curious but also somewhat sickened. Art just shook his head. "I don't want to talk about that," he said. "Just pretend I never brought it up. Some things are better left forgotten." Art left a few minutes later. He gave a friendly wave as he disappeared into the night, but I was far too focused on the burning cubes to pay him any attention. I ran back to my house, trying to find a way to transport them. I found a shovel and ran back, gingerly picking them up with it. I wanted to keep them for observation. I had a small wood-burning stove in the cabin and threw the fiery ice cubes into the cold ashes. As I threw logs on top of them, the wood ignited as if it had been soaked in gasoline, sending sputtering blue flames up. I was sitting down in front of the strange fire show when I heard high-pitched squeals of pain split the air. I instantly recognized the yelping cries of Peaches. I grabbed a shotgun from next to the door and ran outside. The growls and barking had formed into a deafening screech by this point. My eyes widened in horror as I realized what was happening. A brown bear had Peaches by the neck. Its powerful jaws crushed the pit bull's flesh in an instant, and Peaches' cries faded to a whisper, the light in her pupils slowly dying. Her eyes rolled back in her head. I raised the shotgun and sprayed a round of buckshot at the bear. Its rolling eyes turned towards me, its sharp fangs gnashing as it dropped Peaches' twitching body. It started sprinting straight at me with an insane expression of bloodlust on its crazed, furry face. Everything seemed to slow down as I met the creature's eyes and shot it in the mouth. It stopped in its tracks, dripping thick streams of blood from its chin and neck. A single heartbeat later, it turned and sprinted back towards the dark forest in a blur, leaving the dead body of Peaches in its wake. Sickened by the brutal death of my beloved Peaches, I wiped tears away as I went inside to grab a comforter. I wrapped her mutilated, bleeding form in the thick blanket and drove the dog's corpse over to the hole. "Goodbye, Peaches," I said in a voice choked with emotion. I had wrapped the dog up like a mummy. Her body felt heavy and stiff. I inhaled deeply, heaving as I pushed Peaches up on the retaining wall. I felt her cooling blood soaking through the comforter. After resting for a moment, I slid Peaches over the edge, watching her tumble down into the endless darkness. Her body fell straight down without hitting any of the rocky sides. Within a few moments, Peaches had disappeared forever, or so I thought at the time. I remembered waking up early the next morning, hearing a heavy rhythmic bouncing and thudding coming from the direction of the pit. I blinked my eyes blearily, seeing the first bloody streaks of dawn covering the world like a blanket. Then I remembered Peaches' death the previous night, and the strangeness with the hole. Sadness and anxiety crushed my heart at the memory. The sound of grunting and hard thuds came bouncing back again. I threw on some clothes, running outside to see what was making such a racket. I saw a Mexican-looking fellow unloading a truck full of bald, damaged tires into the hole. He was whistling as he worked, his tanned face gleaming with sweat. He had backed the bed of the rusty pickup to the perimeter of the retaining wall. The thudding sound was the tires smashing off the sides of the smooth, rocky walls as they tumbled endlessly down. "Hey!" I yelled, striding forward with long steps. He glanced back at me, his expression never changing. He just continued clearing out the dozens of tires stacked up 5 feet high in the bed. "Morning," he responded cheerfully. "You're up early." "Eh?" "Because of you. Who are you? What are you doing on my property?" I asked, narrowing my eyes at the intruder. He stretched out a thin, grime-streaked hand. I stared down at it as if it were a dead slug. "My name's Miguel, and I've been coming here for years. Man," he said in a thick accent, "I've thrown thousands of tires down here. No one cares. The dumps will pay you to take them off their hands. They don't want to deal with the red tape, right?" "Thousands?" I asked, chagrined. Miguel just nodded proudly. I tried to imagine how much junk must be at the bottom of the hole. There must be hundreds of feet of decaying animals, rusting machinery, flat tires, and whatever other garbage was unlucky enough to find itself eternally imprisoned in this endless pit. Miguel opened his mouth, about to say something, but his words were cut off as a cacophonous wail tore its way up and out of the hole. The eerie scream had a grating, metallic quality to it. I felt goosebumps rise all over my body as Miguel's eyes widened. He stared down into the eternal shadows, leaning over the retaining wall. The shrieking ended as abruptly as it had started. "What the?" he started to say, his bronze skin appearing much paler than when I had first seen him. His brown eyes stared ahead, unbelieving and frightened. The screaming started again, much closer and louder. It sent shockwaves of sound traveling up through the air. I saw the retaining wall shake like a leaf on a tree. A moment later, it crumbled and fell to pieces before my eyes. The metallic wailing faded off again, abruptly plunging us into deafening silence. Miguel gave a loud shriek of surprise and terror as his arms windmilled crazily. He tried to catch himself as the black, lifeless soil surrounding the hole crumbled beneath his feet. I instinctively threw myself back as more and more earth slid into the hole. Miguel tried to crawl up the loose sand, his eyes wide with animal panic. He reached out a trembling hand towards me, but the sands underneath him were flowing like a waterfall. I reached my hand toward him in a futile attempt, watching his rolling eyes as he slid down and disappeared in a single instant. His scream echoed up for what seemed like a very long time. After a minute, it grew fainter and, eventually, disappeared. I stood in stunned silence, staring down at the hole. The entire retaining wall had fallen in, leaving jagged pieces of stone poking out of the earth like broken teeth. As usual, the pit had eaten everything hungrily. There was no sign of the life it had consumed so suddenly, no change in the thick curtain of shadows. I wasn't sure what I had expected, but a sharp feeling of disappointment pierced my chest, though I wasn't sure why. I stared between the rusted brown pickup truck and the hole, as if expecting a magic trick to take place. My thoughts slowly returned in a jumbled mess, a stream of consciousness garble that told me to find help. I sprinted blindly across the dead earth towards the grassy fields surrounding Art's rickety house. Art was already out under the bleary, early morning sun, letting the sheep stream out in excited lines from the wooden barn out back, sweating and hyperventilating. I gave a high-pitched, terrified yell. He jumped, spinning around to look at me. Art, something bad's happened at the pit. Someone fell in. I screamed. His face turned chalk white, his thin, bird-like face falling into a pensive, serious frown. He slowly ambled toward me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Show me," he said simply. Art followed behind, his old man's gait slowed by a pronounced limp. It seemed to take forever to head back toward the pit. He saw the rusty pickup from a distance, his small, watery eyes widening. "Oh shit, it's Miguel," he whispered grimly. I saw the collapsed retaining wall. The bed of the pickup truck was still open, patiently parked a few feet away from the place where the soil had collapsed like a melting glacier. "Yeah, I talked to him for a few minutes," I said, not bringing up the tires. A dozen bald, flat tires still sat waiting in the bed of the truck. Shit, what am I supposed to do? Call the cops? Art froze at this, his normally placid face falling into a grimace. His eyes met mine, as cold and blue as an Alaskan glacier. "Do not call the police," he said, his tone steelier than I had ever heard it. "If the government finds out about this, they will steal your land and probably murder you, and maybe murder me just for good measure. Hell, look what happened to Frank Olson during MKUltra. The US government threw him out a window and made it look like a suicide just to prevent the media from finding out that the CIA was torturing and drugging US citizens, giving them LSD and subjecting them to prolonged physical and sexual abuse. And that was just over LSD. What will they do if they find this? We have no idea what kind of power lives down there." "So what? We're just going to pretend like nothing happened?" I spat back, my face flushing. "What about that guy's family? They'll never know where he went." Art just shook his head. "Trust me, Joshua, it's far better to leave them in the dark. If they get involved, they might find themselves getting thrown down the pit as well." Art pointed to the pickup truck with a shaking finger. "Just put it in neutral and roll it inside. Get rid of the evidence. No one ever needs to know what lies rotting at the bottom of that abyss." Art watched me with an amused half-smile as I got into the pickup truck. The entire cab smelled like tacos and French fries. I saw discarded fast food wrappers all over the seats and floor. "Disgusting," I muttered, starting the engine and putting it in neutral. The engine idled like an old man with pneumonia, gurgling and sputtering in rhythmic waves. I jumped out onto the soft black soil. Deep down, I knew Art was right, though I still felt sick and guilty about covering up this man's death. I imagined Miguel's broken body down there among the thousands of tires, twisted among the rubble with a silent scream still frozen on his lips. "Can you give me a hand with this?" I asked Art as I got behind the truck, preparing to start pushing. I glanced over, but he wasn't looking at me or the pickup truck. He stared intently past me with a look of horror. I followed his line of sight, seeing he was staring at the border of the dark evergreen forest, 50 or 60 feet away. My eyes instantly met those of Miguel's, but he seemed different. I squinted, seeing his eyes were white, crying scarlet tears that streamed down his face. His jaw looked shattered. It hung limply open, sharp pieces of bone poking out through the skin. His clothes were ripped and stained in a rainbow of dark fluids. Oil spot rainbows glimmered next to drippings of thick, clotted blood. Peaches stood by his side, but like Miguel, the dog had changed in death. Her eyes had lost their pupils and irises. Under the dim dawn light, they gleamed a pale, cataract white. Bloody saliva frothed from her silently gnashing jaws. But that wasn't the most horrifying thing. Thousands of blood-red worms ate away at their loose flesh. They fell from Miguel's grey, lifeless skin like raindrops in a heavy storm. Each looked about the size of a maggot, as the carpet of squirming larvae ate away at their hosts. New streams of clotted blood slowly ran down their bodies with the consistency of sludge. I felt sick waves of nostalgia seeing Peaches standing there, chunks of her neck still missing from the bear attack. I had to constantly remind myself that this was not Peaches. This was some abomination from the pit, some dark twisting of my innocent dog's flesh. Oh God, Maria was right, Art whispered in a voice choked with emotion. We should have never come back here. He grabbed my arm with an iron grip, his terror giving his frail hands a seemingly superhuman strength. Peaches and Miguel didn't move. They simply stood there, wavering on their feet, their eyes as blank as those of corpses. Let's just go, I whispered back. They're not moving. I'm not even sure there's any consciousness there behind those blank eyes. They remind me of zombies. They might just stay there. But as soon as we took a step away from Miguel and Peaches, they came to life. I heard a long, low hissing sound that tore its way out of their throats in unison. It echoed like the hissing of many snakes. These things must have been what murdered my wife, Art mumbled, more to himself than to me. A look of shock fell over his wrinkled face. Oh God, it was the pit all along, all of the misfortune and tragedies. It's the center of all of it. I was about to respond when the corpses took off after us with a vengeance. Peaches sprinted forward, the sound of grinding bone splinters in her shattered canine body rising in volume as she came at us. But none of the reanimated corpses seemed to feel any pain. Miguel blindly staggered forward, lunging in strange, dragging steps. The crimson maggots eating away at his body had reached his face and eyes by this point, leaving small rivulets of cold gore wherever they feasted. Fuck. Keep it away from me, Art screamed, taking off as fast as his old man's body would allow. With his pronounced limp, he didn't stand a chance. I sprinted away, passing the old man in seconds. A moment later, I heard a heavy thud and a whoosh of air. I glanced back, seeing Peaches standing on the prone man's chest. She ripped at his shoulder and arms, tearing off chunks of flesh with every bite. Art wailed like a man being burned alive. The red maggots continuously fell off Peaches' body. To my horror, I saw them instantly start burrowing their way into Art's body, slithering into his mouth and nose. Miguel was only a few feet behind the struggling pair, coming straight at me. I headed towards my cabin, trying to block out the dying screams of Art. I flew through the door, slamming it shut behind me. A single heartbeat later, I heard Miguel's body thud into the other side. Frantically, I threw my weight against it and locked it. I lunged for my shotgun, which I always kept propped up next to the door. One of the windows next to the door shattered. I saw a bloody hand reaching in. Miguel blindly climbed up on the sharp shards of glass, ripping open his stomach and chest in the process. Fresh waterfalls of clotted gore and dancing worms slowly dribbled down his mutilated flesh. Another window shattered a moment later. A pale, white hand reached in. I saw the reanimated body of Art, his filmy, dead eyes rolling back and forth over the room of my cabin. When they saw me, they stopped, focusing on me with an insane ferocity. Miguel slunk towards me, his skin a carpet of writhing red maggots now. They skittered all over my wooden floor, slowly crawling towards me, hungry for living tissue. I raised the gun, pointing it at his face. It was half gone by this point, the jawbone hanging limply from a mass of half-digested flesh. I fired, blowing the skull-like face into a mist of blood and bone splinters. And yet, even missing most of his face, Miguel didn't stop, bleeding heavily as his brains leaked out of his forehead. He staggered forward, grabbing at me. I took the stock of the shotgun and slammed it into the bullet wound in the front of his head. There was a sickening, wet crunch as he fell back, his hands blindly swiping the air in an attempt to reach me. He continued gurgling and hissing blood. Art had nearly finished crawling into the other window by this point. Out of ideas, I took the opportunity to escape towards the back of the cabin, away from these reanimated bodies. I saw my car parked on the side of the cabin, only about 20 feet away. I looked both ways out of the back door before flinging it open and sprinting towards freedom. The coast looked clear, but as I reached the door, a heavy thudding of paws came running around the side of the cabin. Peaches snapped at the air with an insane bloodlust, her fur skittering with a carpet of maggots. I pointed the shotgun at her, constantly reminding myself that this was not the real Peaches. She lunged forward, grabbing my ankle as I fired. The bullet ripped her back apart, revealing part of the spine and ribs. The white bone poked out through the ragged strands of flesh for a few moments, until the crimson maggots skittered over the wound and covered it. I felt a burning pain as her powerful jaws bit into my leg. She shook her head from side to side, nearly throwing me off my feet. The pain radiated up my left leg. More small agonies like burning drops of lava covered my arms and hands. I realized that some of the biting maggots had landed on me. In a fit of pure panic, I grabbed the shotgun and shoved the metal barrel into one of Peach's eyes. The orb exploded in a dribble of vitreous fluid before I fired. Peach's head disintegrated under the onslaught of the buckshot. I felt her jaws release a second later, staggering back. I stumbled towards the car. I flung open the door and slammed it shut, locking it. I looked down at my arms, seeing the worms eating their way down towards the muscle, biting through the skin with terrifying efficiency. Quickly, I began plucking them out, squishing them between my fingers. They exploded like tiny water balloons filled with blood. I looked up, seeing that Miguel, Art and Peaches all stood in front of the car. They looked like little more than ragged pieces of decaying flesh by this point. I started the car and accelerated rapidly towards them, hoping to crush all these eldritch creatures in one fell swoop. All three lunged to the side, twisting in jerky, zombie-like movements, even without faces. Miguel and Peaches were still incredibly fast. Without looking back, I drove away, leaving the pit and its many strange mysteries behind forever. Story 3. Pasuda. There is a thing, beneath the woods and the worms, with grave intent, a thing that my grandfather called Pasuda, when he dared to speak its name. That was long ago. Of course, before we left Poland, which now feels like an alien place from an alien time. I was 4 when we moved away, and I barely remember my life before that, like damp clay. Young minds are so easily reshaped or misshapen. It did not take long for me to view England as my home, and I chose to believe that my Polish self had never existed. I chose to forget. Upon learning of Pasuda, most choose the same fate. It is easier than bearing the burden. I was a terrified tot when Grandpa first filled my head with that darkness. But age hasn't helped to digest the unsettling story in my gut. It hasn't cleansed my mind of awful childhood memories. Predominantly, memories of my grandfather cautioning me about the forest and the thing that lived there. Nights on which I'd weep through my thin pillow cover. Pay no mind to his ghost stories. Odette, he comes from a different time, Dad used to say. My parents were the same with me. It's a generational thing. But my mother, Grandpa's own daughter, would defend me. She chastised her father for the stories he told, whether fact or fiction. It wasn't right to scare a child. That was what she reminded him. My mother wanted to shield me. Still, she never asked for the details about the things he would say, only ever told him to stop. I often wonder whether she, too, endured Grandpa's awful tales of the thing below. It all started with childhood curiosity, a blessing and a curse. Before my grandfather told me about Pasuda, he frequently forbade me from entering the nearby forest. That made me unpopular with friends, as they often wanted to play in the woods after school. But I obeyed Grandpa. In return, however, I begged him to at least explain why I must avoid the forest. After enduring months of my incessant nagging, he eventually obliged. I wish he hadn't. It seems wrong that I was punished for my curiosity. It's the very nature of being human. Children long to have their minds opened by those wiser or more experienced. And when it's a safe person, a child asks every question imaginable. Because the wise storyteller is trusted, we know that our loved ones, by design, do not break us. My grandfather broke that cardinal rule. It found me in tuition when I was a boy, he said, and no matter where I go, it follows. What follows, Grandpa? I asked. Pasuda, he replied with a gravelly tone. That word means so many things. My grandfather may well have been talking about some bungling buffoon he'd seen in the woods, but I knew that wasn't what he meant. It is context that defines a word, and Grandpa's voice said it all. I inferred the meaning from his tone. Evil. That was not enough. Of course, it raised only more questions. I had no idea what it meant to be followed by evil. What is Pasuda, Grandpa? I asked. The man grumbled, eyeing the window in fear. It is Pandora's box. In a way, some have it, some don't. If you do, you mustn't ever open it. I surveyed the old man with puzzlement. To a 4-year-old girl, those words mean nothing. Then again, those words may be equally perplexing to anyone who has not experienced Pasuda. It was only with awful experience that I started to appreciate the significance of Grandpa's words. His cautionary tale now weighs heavily on my spirit. My grandfather seemed to notice my confused expression. Do you ever feel sad, Odette? Yes. I shrugged. Grandpa eyed me for a second, then sighed. When a toy breaks or you don't get what you want. I nodded, disheartened that I seemed to be disappointing my grandfather. I didn't understand the vast majority of what he was saying. Nevertheless, I was reaching the age at which I could read people's emotions, so I did sense that my grandfather was frustrated. He was desperately trying to communicate with me, but my vocabulary was limited. It is a wonder that he didn't seem to think about that. Even for a moment, didn't seem to realize that his story was not suitable for a child. Yes, that is sadness. Grandpa nodded, continuing. But there is another form of sadness, one deeper and darker, one not born of reason, but illness. And I pray, Odette, that you never understand what I mean. Your mother was fortunate not to inherit my disease, not to understand how I feel. But sometimes I see the way you look at the world, Odette, and it scares me. Don't be scared, Grandpa, I said, still not comprehending. The man frowned for a second, and his brow sported a few additional folds that rested atop one another. Then he allowed the stack of skin to smoothen with a relaxed expression. Once more, my grandfather offered a plain smile, one that even a 4-year-old could see was disingenuous. I'm not worried, Odette. That isn't what I meant, he chuckled. Okay, you still haven't told me about Pasuda. I huffed. I have, the man answered softly, but I should stop there. Odette, I don't know why I told you any of this. You're too young. I'm not, I gasped, as all children do when being told such a thing. I'm a grown-up. Grandpa smiled. You know, I was young too, when it all started. That is why, in spite of your youth, I believe I have a responsibility to prepare you. I shuffled around on the carpet uncomfortably, disliking Grandpa's tone. Though I didn't know why I disliked it, I knew I regretted asking him about Pasuda, but I didn't want to appear too afraid to hear his tale. I said nothing, letting the old man speak. In 1950, I was 6 years old. My grandfather said, eyeing the window again, Stawishin was a good town, a proud town. I was happy until the feelings arrived. The bad ones? I asked. He nodded. The ones that still make your grandpa a little blue sometimes. Odette. Mummy says that's why you take the medicine, I said. Yes, Odette, that's why I take the medicine. My grandfather nodded. But I didn't take it when I was young. It was a very different world. People with illnesses like mine weren't helped like people in the modern world. Does it hurt? Grandpa? I asked, lip quivering. What? He asked. Being ill all of the time, I said. Grandpa smiled. It's not that kind of illness. Odette, it's not the flu. You're still too young to understand. I was the same. I started to feel different around the age of 6, but I hid it from my parents. I thought I'd been possessed, thought something had infected my soul. Above all else, I feared for my place in society. Men were supposed to be strong, and the thoughts that were filling my head, those were the thoughts of a weak man. At least, that was what I supposed they would say about me. I don't understand, I said. I know, Odette, he replied. You're so young, but the darkness doesn't care about that. Pasuda doesn't care about age. It doesn't care about innocence. It doesn't care about what is fair. It just takes. And I don't want it to take anything from you, Odette. You're scaring me, Grandpa, I whimpered. The man's eyes widened. I didn't mean to frighten you. Hush now. No crying. Just let me explain myself. Let me explain what happened to me as a boy. Okay? And then you'll understand. You'll never need to be afraid again, because you'll know what not to do. Yes? I nodded, tightening every muscle in my face to prevent tears from welling in my eyes. I didn't know why I was scared, but, as I mentioned, a child doesn't need to understand words to understand meaning. I sensed the sincerity in Grandpa's voice, the fear in his voice. It was contagious. I was walking through the forest near my hometown. I always tell you never to go in the woods, don't I? He asked. Yes, I whispered. Well, you must heed that warning in all places, Grandpa explained. You see, it is not that the trees carry any weight, not the soil, not the plants, not the animals. No, it's about the feeling that a forest evokes. Odette, a beautiful place during the day, but at night, not so much. The man paused, before sighing. Pasuda lies in all corners, Odette, but it prefers nooks and crannies. The corners not frequented by people. After all, those are the places that we fear, the places we avoid, the places that make us weak. Not all people, perhaps, but some. And Pasuda strikes only those with a tender disposition. Like you, Grandpa? I asked, quivering. He nodded. Like me, Odette, the vulnerable. I was walking through the forest, and I came upon a ring of twigs placed neatly on the ground, a ring the size of a bicycle wheel. My friends and I would sometimes stroll through that area, so I thought one of them had built it. A smile filled my face, which was a rarity for me at that age. After the sickness took hold, I didn't want to lose that sliver of happiness, so I did it. Did what? I asked. My grandfather's smile faded. I broke the circle. Odette swept my shoe through the decoration of branches, then laughed to myself. However, afterwards, I noticed something in the muddy clearing at the heart of the shattered circle. The dirt was smooth, oddly smooth, as if it were covering something, and when I toed the mud, pushing the cap of my boot into the dirt, I could tell that the inner circle was hollow. I kept pushing, heart racing, and I almost saw what lay beneath the soil. I was so close, so painfully close. But what? Grandpa? I squeaked, voice barely audible. Something interrupted me, the man coldly replied. In my peripheral vision, I saw a shape move behind a nearby tree. It was daytime. Mind you, this was no trick of shadows at night. I know what I saw. Something moved behind the tree. "One of your friends?" I hopefully queried. "No, Odette," the man answered. "Not one of my friends. The shape was far too tall for that." "What did you do?" I whispered. "The same thing that any child would do in that situation," he replied. "I ran home." "Was it the Pasuda?" I asked, hardly wanting an answer. Grandpa ignored the question. Breaking the circle was only the first step. It was the invitation, and I have been pursued for 54 years before I broke the ring. The illness had already been burgeoning in the depths of my mind. A sickness like this is innate, no doubt about that. But it can be kept at bay until one chooses to welcome it inside. Never welcome Pasuda. Odette, if you ever find a ring, a circle, in a place like that, just walk away. "A ring of sticks?" I asked. "No, sweetie, it's not about the sticks. It's not about the forest. He sighed. "It's useless. That's what, telling you all of this. It's useless. You don't understand, and I pray that you never will." "Is there more, Grandpa?" I asked, still striving to be brave. "When did you see Pasuda? When did you learn its name?" "Name?" the man mumbled, raising an eyebrow. "A thing like that has no name. Odette, I call it Pasuda because it is Pasuda. That's as tangible as it'll ever be." "Tangible?" I asked. "What does that mean?" "Never mind. I'll finish my story. Odette," Grandpa said, "but it'd be better for you to not ask questions. You don't want answers. Not really. If you never understand, enjoy a blessed life. If you do understand, God save you. Will you listen quietly?" I nodded weakly. "Good," he replied. "You mustn't tell your mother what I'm about to tell you. She wouldn't understand. I'm doing it to protect you." I held my breath as Grandpa adjusted himself in his seat. The first step was welcoming the sickness, breaking its sacred ring, my grandfather said. The next step was experiencing loss. That is what happens after the sickness is let inside. It takes something from you. It may be something physical, such as your beloved teddy bear. Odette, the one you lost on holiday last year. Remember, that was loss. Or it may be something that cannot be touched. Do you understand? I nodded again, but the words were nonsensical to my ears. For me, loss came in the form of... Grandpa trembled, seemingly retaining fearful tears. I came home to something vile. Odette, a week after I broke the circle. A week of feeling watched, pushing down with such force that it sought to drive me into the ground itself. And then, on a day no different from any other, I saw her. Mother. My mother. I mean, she was dangling from the awning above the front porch, surrounded by neighbors and a police officer. Dangling? I asked. Yes. No, I shouldn't explain myself. Odette, my grandfather said. My mother passed away. She died. That's all you need to know. I'm sorry, I timidly replied. It's okay, Odette. You never knew her, and it was my fault. I invited it inside, Grandpa whispered. Losing part of oneself is the second step. Pasuda longs to weaken its prey. It convinces you, much like the devil, that it does not exist at all. That is what makes it truly horrifying. And it is easier for a person to listen that way. You start to believe that you might simply be hearing your own thoughts. Once I believed that, I listened to all of the awful things the voice had to say. Things that had been muted and muffled until I saw my mother's lifeless neck strangled by that rope. Rope? I asked. I didn't mean... Forget what I said. Odette, he sharply said. The point is that I became sicker, and the voice of Pasuda became louder, a parasitic evil born only to feed. Are you okay, Grandpa? I shuddered, noting his pale face and manic demeanor. Yes, he nodded, sweating heavily. I'm better now. Things haven't been as bad for the past couple of decades. My child, the pills quieten things, numb me, make me lesser. But that's okay, because the medicine makes Pasuda lesser too, sometimes. I nodded, reminding myself not to ask questions. I'd already forgotten a couple of times, and I didn't want my grandfather to stop telling his story entirely. "I won't tell you what it told me," Grandpa whispered. "Better I not put any ideas in your head. You want to know whether I saw it, don't you?" And the answer is, I don't know. I saw something, but I just don't know. I only know that it's real. Odette, after one horrible night, a few weeks later, I never doubted that again. I sat quietly, tightly compressing my lips to still the questions itching to wriggle free. I was lying in bed, trying to hush the voice in my head, the nagging, intrusive thoughts, the earworms that had been burrowing into my canals for a month or maybe longer, maybe long before I even disturbed that ring of twigs in the forest, for I had always been sick. "Odette, and something happened to make me accept that," he said. "What happened?" I asked, clasping my mouth a second too late. My grandfather sighed. "I will tell you once and never again. Odette, do it, do it, do what I say." The voice cried that tirelessly, and I finally obliged. I stopped ignoring it, stopped fighting the thoughts. I looked at my open doorway, eyeing the thing that had been begging me to pay attention for weeks. I did not hear the creak of a floorboard, not the growl of a predator, not anything. In fact, as the voice in my ears vanished, the pressure released. After several long days, the voice disappeared because I finally paid attention to it. The old man paused for a few seconds, limbs twitching uncontrollably. Grandpa looked physically ill, though he always explained that his sickness was not anything tangible, something I would understand in later life. It was watching me from the hallway. "Odette," the man eventually said. "What was watching you?" I cried, heart punctured by dread. "Nothing with a name," my grandfather replied. "Pasuda is the title I chose, and even that word feels like ash on my tongue." "Grandpa," I whimpered, tears trickling down my cheeks. "I don't know what you mean. What did you see in the hallway?" He bawled too, speaking with a brittle timbre. "It was nothing, Odette, nothing wearing something. I knew that, whatever I saw before me, it was a lie, a physical manifestation of something not physical at all, something that didn't belong in our world." I sobbed, and Grandpa sighed, before shushing me. "It was a plague, Odette," he continued, "a cancerous bulge of tumor-riddled flesh. Pasuda is not something that can be seen by our eyes. I know that now. It wore the mask of something human eyes could see and understand. It was almost a body, and that revolting appearance was terrifying, but not as terrifying as what hid underneath. What I didn't see, the transparent evil that had been stalking me for months, the thing that still follows, wearing whatever ails me. I didn't respond, not in any way that I remember, and for countless nights after that, I sobbed. From that day forth, during our final months in Poland, Grandpa would only mention Pasuda when issuing warnings. He would tell me to stay away from the forest and circles, anything that might invite Pasuda into our world, for it had nothing to do with trees, dirt, or worms. It had everything to do with me and the decisions I would make. Grandpa Alexei stopped talking about the faceless, nameless abomination when we started our new lives in England, and when I asked others in my family about his campfire tale, they seemed confused. My younger brother, Antoni, was 2 years old when we moved to England, so he didn't remember any of the tales Grandpa told in Poland. My mother would simply chortle and tell me not to fret about her father's ramblings. He had been a few pennies short of a pound for years. I asked him about the monster again at the age of 8. "Why don't you talk about it anymore, Grandpa?" I asked. "What do you mean, Odette?" the man grumbled, lifting a grey, overgrown brow. "Pasuda," I said. My grandfather smiled at me warmly, the cozy smile he would wear before offering any words of kindness, any words of soothing strength. And that smile disarmed me, as I did not expect the words which gushed out of his curved grin. "If you ever speak of it again, I will seal those lips," he softly warned. After yelping in terror, I told my mother about Grandpa's threat, and she scolded her father. He was kinder to me after that, and I stopped mentioning Pasuda. That was the unspoken agreement between us. I understood his message, heard him loud and clear. Even at such a young age, it was a haunting warning. But that was what I needed. Pasuda was not an evil to be dismissed, but it was also not one to discuss. As the years passed, so did my nightmares, and Pasuda became nothing more than a childhood fable, something that I was forced to endure, whilst Anthony was spared, and that seemed telling. After all, if the creature were real, if it was something worth fearing and avoiding at all costs, then surely Grandpa would have told my little brother once he'd reached an appropriate age. Then again, my grandfather changed after we moved to England. He retreated inwards, becoming an oddly reserved man. The medicine no longer seemed to help him, and my mother started to worry that old age, rather than his pre-existing mental illness, might be to blame. I turned 24 this year. I've gained 2 decades of experience since Grandpa first told me his tale of terror. Regardless of how foggy that story became in my mind, it lingered. I finally appreciated what my grandfather had been trying to tell me. Finally appreciated that his prediction had come true. I was unwell. Maybe not like him, but it had always been there, at the back of my mind. I knew that my grandfather struggled with severe depression. I learnt that he tried to take his life, years before I was born, and that explained so much. For me, however, my psychological poison has always been anxiety, fear, dread. An innate fear, I should say, one detached from reason. My depression is a byproduct of that. I am not so different from Grandpa. There may be some hereditary nature to my mental illness. He certainly thought so when I was a child. Anxiety, depression, labels, labels, labels. We all want to color coordinate our gray matter, as if that does anything to organize it. Wisely, I chose not to follow Grandpa's dated advice about suppressing psychological problems. Over the years, I confronted my illness. I didn't directly address my irrational fears, admittedly, but I pushed myself out of my comfort zone. My family members and friends were shocked by my decision to pursue a career as a firefighter. Nonetheless, after an apprenticeship and years of training, my dream came true. 6 months ago, I became a firefighter, and I believed that I'd found the cure to fear. After facing real-world danger, intrusive thoughts would seem inconsequential. That logic seemed sound to me, though it would quickly disintegrate. Still, I'd made something of myself, become more of a person. In my eyes, that was my illness talking. Of course, but I will say that this line of work has improved me in so many ways. It is a dangerous vocation, but one that has transformed my body and my soul. There is no denying, of course. Last month, we responded to a fire at a multi-story block of apartments in the city centre. A resident named Darius Havisham had a stroke, leaving his stove unattended, and the flames spread before anybody knew what was happening. He was nothing but a charred corpse when we arrived. But there were others, unharmed, who were still trapped in the building. Our team had 5 floors to sweep. It was not the tallest block of flats in the city, by any stretch of the imagination, but still a huge area to cover in a short window of time. When we reached the top floor, my mind wasn't entirely there. Seeing the corpse of Darius Havisham, roasted beyond recognition, had fractured something within me. I'd been working as a firefighter for 5 months at that point, and his body was the first truly horrific thing I'd seen, the first corpse I'd seen. It personified the inferno. The fire had devoured the man's flesh and stripped him down to bones. Those flames seemed sinister, somehow terrified me as I realized that, for months, I'd been walking through hellscapes. The fire licked at my suit with egregious intent, rather than being swayed by an unthinking breeze. It lived, and it was cruel. I barely heard the words of my colleague as we scoured apartment 511. "Odette," Diego repeated. "What?" I panted into my amplified facepiece. "The kitchen?" he shouted back. "Yes," I breathlessly replied. "All clear." "Me? Lounge. You? Bedroom?" he barked in brief, clear orders, nodding at the room I needed to explore. I rushed towards the door and barged it inwards with a sturdy shoulder. It didn't require much force. Of course, as flames had weakened the wood, upon entering the bedroom, I immediately saw her, the sobbing girl on the bed. "Resident," I yelled, "requesting assistance." Diego yelled something inaudible in return, and footsteps followed from the hallway beyond the apartment as other firefighters approached. I barely registered any of that. However, as I was focused on the fire's behavior, I am not a seasoned professional in my city's fire department. However, I know, much like the average Joe, how flames naturally act, and there was no reason for the fire to have moved outwards from the center of the room, forming a circular clearing in the center without ceremony. That clearing began to darken. There appeared a smooth, blackened mass in the cleared core of the fiery ring. "Diego!" I yelled. "Assistance!" I'm cut off. "Odette!" Diego cried. "All units. Assistance in apartment 511. I eyed the black clearing in fear, the circle that even the flames, which had horrified me moments earlier, seemed to fear, seemed to avoid like cursed land. The blackened carpet looked like a hole. Though the floor had not disappeared, it felt wrong to my eyes, as if I were seeing something that shouldn't be seen, something that certainly shouldn't be touched. My finger lightly rested on the trigger to my extinguisher, paralyzed by a subconscious compartment of my mind, some self-preserving instinct, and the girl on the bed appeared to feel the same way. She was quivering on her mattress, unwilling to move towards me. She viewed the black clearing as a hole too, a hole that wasn't really a hole. I could see that in her eyes. It was a chasm 4 feet in diameter, but for a girl around 10 years old, it might as well have been a canyon. "What's your name?" I loudly asked. The girl responded, but I didn't hear her over the radio chatter and crackling flames. Didn't hear her over the hole, which seemed to call in some soundless way, called with deafening silence. I wished I could see either the carpet or the apartment beneath the black mass. Something natural, physical, real. Yet, I saw only blackness, though I was convinced that something might be hiding within. "Odette!" Gary yelled. The third firefighter burst into the flat, standing in apartment 511's main hallway, with eyes flitting between the bedroom and the end of the corridor. "Diego, you stuck?" Gary asked. Extinguisher broken. "Help Odette!" Diego shouted in return. Gary ignored the request and began to extinguish the hallway fire with his equipment, creating a safe passage for Diego to reach the two of us. "Damn it." "Gary!" Diego growled. "Odette. Odette!" Gary yelled. The longer I eyed the blackness before me, the sicker I felt. I could have waited for Gary and Diego to enter the room, could have consulted with them, should have, most certainly, left the fiery ring alone. Grandpa's words rang distantly in my mind, his story of the unearthly circle in the forest, his warning to steer clear of such things. However, I never would have been able to live with the thought of abandoning a child in a burning room, even if I'd somehow explained it to my colleagues. That girl's face would have haunted me until my dying day. I sensed the horror of the circle. I felt the urge to run. But why fight to survive if I'd spend the rest of my life suffering? That was why I lunged forwards. My suit was singed by the barrier of flames, breaking the circle as my boot landed on the black floor within the clearing. The only foundation that felt steady in the entire building. Everywhere else, the floor had been decaying, but that black clearing felt almost fixed, immovable. Yet, as I raced through the circle, I remained convinced that the darkness must, in fact, be a hole. I sensed something at the bottom. When I reached the far end of the circle, I broke through the opposite side of the curved, fiery barrier, and then I scooped the bawling girl off her mattress. She gasped as I lifted her up, which seemed a natural reaction to the situation at hand. The more I reflect on this day, however, the more I consider that she might have gasped at something else. Her eyes seemed to meet something in the doorway, and somehow, as if that moment in time were endless, I caught a reflection in one of her pupils. Her glossy, glassy eye revealed a momentary flicker of darkness, quickly replaced by the orange glow of flames. "Odette!" Diego roared as Gary attempted to douse the flames. However, as the liquid agent met the circle of fire, the inferno responded with a disapproving snarl. Seeming to enlarge, the four of us gawped as the fire continued to resist Gary's equipment. I closed my eyes, slowing my breathing and ignoring the warmth of my skin. Direct contact with the flames had damaged my suit, but it would likely survive the return trip. I wasn't worried about that. I was worried about the girl in my arms who wore cotton pajamas. That left me with no other reasonable option. I lifted the small child as high as humanly possible, feeling my arm muscles strain and tear. In spite of my fitness training, I felt as if I'd stretched beyond my limits. It is remarkable, nevertheless, what a human can achieve in the name of survival. On uneven legs, I took powerful strides forwards, crossing through the threshold of fire into the blackened clearing. The girl shrieked as flames passed just beneath her elevated body. When I reached the blazing barrier at the other side of the circle, Gary and Diego immediately seized the girl from my arms, and I breathed a sigh of relief as I escaped from the ring. My skin was scorching, and I knew that I'd been seconds from earning second-degree burns. But I was alive. The girl was alive. We were all alive. And the adrenaline pumping through my veins had flushed out all of the unease I felt about the ring's black clearing, about the shape I'd seen in one of the girl's eyes. I thought only of the corpse I'd seen. That was all the trauma I felt able to bear. Still, I was grateful to safely exit that building with every firefighter and, other than Darius Havisham, every resident. I kept reminding myself of that blessing as fear seeped into every inch of my being, every crevice of my flesh. The goosebumps didn't flatten with ease. Even when Diego and I spent our evening at the local drinking hole to flood our senses, I was hoping to drown any remaining vestige of adrenaline in my body. "Today was your toughest day," Diego said. "You did well. Odette, we saved everyone." "Not Mr. Havisham," I whispered. He nodded somberly. "We did everything we could. We did a good thing. Okay?" "It doesn't feel that way," I said. Seeing his body was awful. "That's the most devastating aspect of this job," he replied. "You will see things that break your heart and your mind, but you're strong. You'll get through it. I promise." "Not as strong as you think," I sniffled. The man reached a hand across the table, clasping mine in a matter entirely unprofessional, but I didn't contest it. We'd built a bond over the months, and I had no qualms about that. Diego and I felt the same way about one another. However, I was a fraud. He didn't know every side of me. He didn't know the weak side, the sick side, the side that Grandpa had always warned might lurk beneath the sturdy exterior of my character. "You'll die alone." "What?" I gasped, eyeing Diego frightfully. The man frowned. "Sorry, did I say something?" I opened my lips, about to respond, and then I realized he hadn't spoken. The voice had came from somewhere else, somewhere within, some intrusive, self-sabotaging thought from a distorted version of myself, the version that I had been suppressing for years, emerging with sharper clarity than ever before, as if woken from some lifelong slumber. A new version of Odette was born, activated. Tell yourself that if it helps, I thought. No, I cleared my throat. Never mind. Diego, it's nothing. I just feel horrible after today. I don't feel right. Over the following days, my paranoia only worsened. The intrusive voice loudened, sounding so much like my own, that ever-present imposter. And it didn't take long for the strains in my relationship to show. Diego was a straightforward man, with a demeanor steady and unwavering, but he'd been transformed into someone unrecognizable, someone just as unbalanced as me. And I only blame myself. My sickness had become his sickness. My struggle had become his struggle. Watching me spiral into a well of despair had convinced Diego that the only rational recourse would be to dive after me. He realized, once we began to drown, that both of us were trapped, with no rope to hoist ourselves out. "You don't deserve him," I thought. "You and I just don't work," I mumbled. "I'm not the person I tried to be. You need someone stronger. That's stupid, Diego whispered, absent-mindedly. Stupid. I shouldn't have ever worn that suit, I said. This job isn't right for someone of my constitution. It's been days, and I'm still thinking about Darius Havisham. That's normal, Odette, he assured me. You saved that girl, Rebecca Harrington. She's alive because you ran through fire. You were made for this. You're just suffering from shock. It's horrible, but you'll get through it. We'll get through it. I shook my head. Diego, it's changing you, seeing me suffer like this. You're not equipped to tolerate me, and that's okay. It's okay. Please, let's just... I don't want us to end. Odette, Diego firmly interrupted. I like you, might even love you. Suffering mentally isn't... It doesn't change how I feel about you. I buckled. He had said all of the correct things, convincing me that he could handle my illness, convincing me that he could handle my instability. Or perhaps Diego had simply been telling the truth. Perhaps he had still seen me as strong, sturdy, reliable. Whatever the case, I didn't fully recognize the toll it was taking on him. I knew the man had changed, becoming fragile and jittery, like me, but I didn't know just how deeply the darkness flowed. 1 week after the Havisham fire, Diego took a sick day. He said he needed to sleep, and I agreed. The man had spent days consoling me whilst I endured sleepless nights. It had deprived him of rest too, and I'd already taken a few sick days, so he insisted that I should go to work whilst he would stay at home. It'll be good for you. He smiled unconvincingly. I'm fine, just tired. I'll be back tomorrow. Okay, I'm sure it'll be a slow day for you today. Don't worry. I nodded, realizing that I had to bite the bullet at some point. The sooner I returned to work, the better. By avoiding it, the very concept of that place was becoming frightening, and I refused to let this incident break me. Everything was happening as I'd expected. After all, I'd joined the fire department to push myself beyond my limits, conquer fear. It was some extreme form of exposure therapy. I wanted to push onwards. When I returned home after that first day back, around 5 in the afternoon, the apartment felt stale, not just quiet, but silent, not just still, but stuck. It didn't feel like home, and it didn't feel as if I were alone. You're alone, I thought. Truthfully, it felt quite the opposite. Dread tinged my heart as I felt a nothingness watching me, an absence, something that meant harm. There's nothing, and you're coming undone, I thought. Diego? I called. There was no response, so I waded through the resistant air, passing from room to room in a bid to find him, or find the unrecognizable man who'd replaced Diego over the past few days. When I entered the kitchen, I screamed. The oven door was ajar, and a red light blazed above it, permeating a thick, smoky mist. The fire alarm hadn't sounded, oddly, but I didn't fully process that until later. I was focusing on what hung out of the oven, Diego's body. It seemed apparent that he'd chosen this unthinkable fate, given that there was no sign of any struggle. But I collapsed, unable to accept that he would do this to himself. Not only that he would choose to end his life, but that he'd do so in such a dreadful way. He'd burnt his upper half to a crisp without any resistance, without pulling himself out of the oven. A slow, agonizing death. I didn't know why any person would choose that, especially Diego. The man had struggled for the past week, but it wasn't right. He hadn't been suffering to this extent. It wasn't him, and that horrified me beyond words. Horrified me because it confirmed what I'd already been suspecting for days. Something was clinging to me, a darkness that had traveled beyond the burning apartment by gluing itself to the sole of my boot. As I left that circle of fire, I felt it, the weight that left with me, the shape that had watched me from some hidden place. It was still watching me, a thing that I didn't see, perhaps couldn't see. I finally accepted that my childhood had been no lie. Grandpa's story had been real, though I had long convinced myself otherwise, long convinced myself that he hadn't ever told the story at all. In fact, unfortunately, It was all happening exactly as he promised. First, I disturbed the ring, inviting Pasuda to follow. Then, I suffered loss, weakening my spirit, making myself susceptible to the being. I feared the third step, and I needed to see the one person who might be able to save me from it. Save me from ending up like him. Story 4. It was late on a Friday night and I was mindlessly scrolling through Reddit. My usual haunts included gaming tech and conspiracy subreddits. I'd been fascinated with the darker corners of the internet for as long as I could remember and had read countless horror stories about the dark web. Like many, I was skeptical about most of them. They seemed too far-fetched, too perfectly terrifying to be real. But then I came across a post in our Deep Web Invitation to the Silent Web. The title alone sent a chill down my spine. A post was from a user named Obsidian Veil, and it contained a single link and a brief description. Enter if you dare the silent web is not with a faint of heart. You've been warned. The comments were filled with a mix of curious users and seasoned dark web explorers dismissing it as a hoax, but something about the post intrigued me. Maybe it was the simplicity or the user's ominous name. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I clicked on the link, which led me to a series of instructions on how to access the dark web using Tor. This was nothing new to me. I'd been down this path before out of curiosity rather than a desire to buy drugs or engage in illegal activities. Following the instructions, I found myself on a page with a simple, unassuming design. Welcome to the silent web, it read. Proceed at your own risk. A single button labeled enter waited at the bottom of the page. I hesitated for a moment, then clicked. The screen flickered and I was taken to a new page that looked like an old outdated forum. The design was basic, almost crude, but the content was anything but. Threads had titles like Echoes in the Dark, The Eyes of the Abyss, and Whispers from the Void. Most were filled with cryptic messages and disturbing images. One thread caught my eye. The doll maker. The title alone was enough to make my skin crawl. I clicked on it. The thread was filled with posts about a user who called himself the doll maker. According to the posts, he would send out invitations to specific users asking if they wanted to play a game. Those who accepted would receive a package containing a doll that looked eerily similar to themselves. The instructions included with the doll were simpler: keep the doll in your home and under no circumstances should you try to get rid of it. The posts described horrifying experiences. People who tried to destroy the doll would find it back in its original place the next day in perfect condition. Some claimed the doll moved on its own, showing up in different rooms or positions. Others reported hearing whispers in the night or feeling like they were being watched. I felt a mixture of fascination and dread. It had to be a hoax, right? Just an elaborate prank to scare gullible users. But then I received a private message from Obsidian Veil. I see you found the doll maker. Would you like an invitation? My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't want to respond, but my curiosity got the better of me. I typed out a quick reply. What's the catch there? Response was immediate. No catch, just a game. Do you want to play? I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. This was stupid. I knew it was stupid, but I typed out a single word and hit send. Yes, within minutes I received another message, an address and a time. Be here tomorrow night at 11 p.m. Call me alone. The address was in a part of town I wasn't familiar with, a rundown industrial area that I knew was mostly abandoned. I spent the rest of the night toing and turning, second-guessing my decision, but when the time came, I found myself driving through the deserted streets, my GPS leading me to a decrepit warehouse. I parked my car and approached the building, my heart in my throat. The door creaked open and I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and decay. I made my way through the darkened halls until I found a room lit by a single flickering bulb. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was a box. Next to the box was a note: welcome to the game, take the doll home, follow the instructions. With trembling hands I opened the box. Inside was a doll about 2 feet tall, dressed in clothes that looked similar to what I was wearing. Its face was an almost perfect replica of mine down to the smallest detail. I stuffed the doll back into the box and rushed out of the warehouse, my mind racing. This was a mistake, a huge mistake. but it was too late to turn back. Now I took the box home and set it on the kitchen table, staring at it like it might come to life at any moment. The note had said to follow the instructions. I unfolded the paper that had been inside the box with the doll. It was simple and handwritten. Keep the doll in your home. Do not attempt to get rid of it. You will be contacted. Soon the first few days were uneventful. I kept the doll on a shelf in my living room and for the most part tried to forget it was there, but as the days turned into weeks, strange things started happening. I would come home to find the doll in a different position than I had left it. Sometimes it was turned slightly, other times it had moved to a completely different spot. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things, that maybe I had moved it without realizing, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I started hearing faint whispers at night just on the edge of my hearing, like someone was standing right behind me, murmuring in my ear. One night I woke up to find the doll sitting on the edge of my bed, its eyes fixed on mine. I screamed and threw it across the room, my heart racing, but when I turned on the lights, the doll was back on the shelf exactly where it had been before I reached out to you. Obsidian veil demanding answers. Their response was cryptic. The game has only just begun. Do you want to quit? Yes, I typed back. Furiously, I want out. There is no out, came the reply. The doll maker doesn't play fair. In the following days, the activity escalated. The whispers grew louder, turning into incoherent murmurs that seemed to come from all around me. Objects in my apartment started moving on their own. I would find chairs knocked over, doors open that I was sure I had closed, and lights flickering without reason. The final straw came when I woke up one morning to find a new doll sitting next to the first one. This one was smaller, but it bore an uncanny resemblance to my younger sister, who lived in another city. Terrified for her safety, I called her, but she didn't answer. Panic set in as I tried to reach her, but to no avail. Desperate, I turned back to the dark well, hoping to find a way to end this nightmare. I posted a frantic message on the silent web forum begging for help. To my surprise, I received a reply almost immediately from a user named You, an entity. I can help you, they wrote, but it won't be easy. I didn't care. I was willing to do whatever it took to end this. I replied, asking what I needed to do. Meet me in the same place you found the doll. Midnight come alone. Déjà vu washed over me as I made my way back to the abandoned warehouse. This time the atmosphere was even more oppressive, the air heavy with a sense of foreboding. I found entity waiting for me, their face hidden in the shadows. There's a way to break the curse, they said, but it's dangerous. You need to confront the doll maker. How? I asked, by voice trembling. Follow me, they replied, leading me deeper into the warehouse. We reached a room filled with old dusty furniture and broken toys. In the center was a circle of candles, their flames flickering eerily. An entity handed me a piece of paper with an incantation written on it. Read this, they instructed. It will summon the doll maker. You need to be strong. Don't show. Here, I took the paper with shaking hands and began to read the incantation aloud. The air grew colder with each word, and the shadows seemed to close in around us. When I finished, there was a moment of silence before a chilling voice filled the room. You summoned me, it hissed. Why? A figure stepped out of the darkness, tall and imposing. The doll maker, his face was obscured by a mask, and his eyes glinted with malevolence. I want out, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I want this to end. The doll maker laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. It's not that simple, he said. The game has rules. You broke them. Now you must pay the price. Before I could react, he lunged at me. The candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. I felt a searing pain as something sharp sliced across my arm. I screamed, stumbling back, but there was nowhere to run. In the chaos, I heard an entity's voice chanting something in a language I didn't understand. The dollmaker screamed in rage, and the room was suddenly flooded with light. The dollmaker was gone, and an entity was standing over me, their face pale and saint-trained. We don't have much time, they said urgently. He'll be back. Follow me. We hurried through the maze of dark, decrepit corridors until we reached a hidden trapdoor. An entity pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the bowels of the building. We descended quickly, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a small, dimly lit room filled with strange symbols etched into the walls. In the center of the room was a large, ancient-looking mirror. Entity gestured for me to stand in front of it. This mirror is the gateway to the dollmaker realm, they explained. You need to confront him there on his own turf and destroy his essence. Only then will the curse be broken. I stared at the mirror, my reflection wavering in the dim light. It was a terrifying prospect, but I knew I had no other choice. Summoning all my courage, I stepped forward and placed my hand on the cold glass. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, and I felt myself being pulled through. The sensation was disorienting, like being sucked into a vortex. When I finally emerged on the other side, I found myself in a dark, twisted version of the warehouse. The walls were lined with shelves filled with dolls of all shapes and sizes, each one staring down at me with lifeless eyes. The air was thick with the scent of decay and the faint whispering of countless voices. At the far end of the room, the dollmaker stood, waiting. "You've come to my domain," he said, his voice echoing ominously. How brave, how foolish. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "This ends now," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. The doormaker laughed, a cold, hollow sound that reverberated through the room. "You think you can defeat me? Here I am, invincible." He raised his hands, and the dolls on the shelves began to move, their glassy eyes turning to fix on me. They started to crawl down from their perches, their limbs moving with a grotesque, jerky motion. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. Nen's voice echoed in my mind. "Destroy his essence." I had to find a way to weaken him, to make him vulnerable. Desperation fueled my actions as I grabbed one of the dolls and smashed it against the ground. To my surprise, the dollmaker flinched, a look of pain crossing his masked face. I realized then that the dolls were somehow connected to him, extensions of his being. If I could destroy enough of them, it might weaken him enough for me to finish the job. I began to tear through the room, smashing dolls left and right, each one shattered with a satisfying crunch, and with each destruction the dollmaker grew weaker, his form flickering like a faulty projection. Furious, he lunged at me, but I was ready. I dodged his attack and grabbed a heavy, ornate doll from a nearby shelf. It looked older and more detailed than the others, its eyes a deep, unsettling shade of red. I had a feeling this one was special, more important than the rest. "This is for my sister," I said, and with all my strength I hurled the doll to the ground. It shattered into a million pieces, and the dollmaker screamed a sound of pure agony. His form wavered and began to disintegrate, the shadows consuming him. "No, you can't do this," he shrieked, but it was too late. His essence dissipated, and the room around me began to collapse. The dolls fell lifelessly to the ground, their spell broken. I felt a force pulling me back toward the mirror, and I didn't resist. The next thing I knew, I was back in the hidden room with null entity gasping for breath. The mirror was dark and cracked, its power spent. "It's over," Nenti said, helping me to my feet. "You did it." I nodded too, exhausted to speak. We made our way back up to the main floor of the warehouse and out into the cold night air. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the curse lift from my shoulders. In the days that followed, I received word from my sister. She was safe and had no memory of anything unusual happening. The dolls in my apartment were gone, and the strange occurrences ceased. Life slowly returned to normal, but I knew I would never forget the horrors I had faced. The silent web was dismantled shortly after its creators arrested by the authorities. Now entity and I kept in touch, forming a bond forged in the fires of shared trauma. Together we vowed to keep others from falling into the same trap, using our knowledge to fight back against the dark corners of the internet. But even now, sometimes late at night, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. The shadows seem a little darker, the whispers a little closer, and I know deep down that the dollmaker's legacy isn't truly gone. It lingers, waiting for the right moment to return, and when it does, I'll be ready. Years passed, and the memories of my encounter with the dollmaker gradually faded into the background of my life. I had managed to rebuild, to find a semblance of peace. Entity, whose real name was Mark, became a close friend and confidant. Together we dedicated ourselves to unearthing and exposing the darkest secrets of the internet, preventing others from falling into the same traps. We had barely escaped one rainy afternoon while I was working on a new project. My phone buzzed with an alert. It was a message from Mark. "Need to talk. Urgent." My heart sank. I hadn't heard that tone of urgency from him since our ordeal with the Dollmaker, I quickly replied, arranging to meet at our usual spot, a quiet cafe. Downtown, when I arrived, I found Mark already there, a grim expression on his face. He slid a laptop across the table. To me, "Take a look at this," he said. I opened the laptop and found a series of encrypted files. Mark explained that he had been contacted by a former member of the silent web, someone who had managed to stay under the radar during the initial crackdown. This person, who went by the alias Eclipse, claimed to have discovered remnants of the Dollmaker's network still active in the deep web. "It's worse than we thought," Mark said. "Eclipse believes the Dollmaker wasn't just a lone operator. He was part of a larger, more insidious organization, and they're still out there continuing his work." My blood ran cold as I scrolled through the files. They detailed various sightings and reports of new dolls appearing in people's homes, accompanied by the same eerie instructions. It seemed the curse had spread, infecting more and more unsuspecting victims. "We have to stop this," I said, my voice resolute. "We can't let what happened to us happen to anyone else." Mark nodded, agreed, "But we need to be smart about this. Eclipse has agreed to meet with us and provide more information. They might be able to help us take down this organization for good." We arranged to meet Eclipse the following night at a secluded location outside the city. As we drove through the dark, winding roads, a sense of dread settled over me. This felt all too familiar, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into another trap. We arrived at an old abandoned farmhouse. Eclipse was already there, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. They wore a hooded cloak, their face obscured by darkness. "You must be Mark and Alex," they said, their voice low and rasping. "I've been expecting you." We followed Eclipse inside, where they led us to a small room filled with old computer equipment. The walls were covered in maps and diagrams detailing the network of the Dollmaker's organization. "It's called the Collective," Eclipse explained, "a group of individuals who believe in harnessing the power of fear and despair to achieve their goals. The Dollmaker was one of their operatives, but there are many more like him." They showed us a list of names and locations, each one a potential target. It was a chilling realization that this wasn't just a remnant of the past, but an active, ongoing threat. "We need to act fast," Eclipse said. "I've managed to locate one of their primary hideouts. If we can gather enough evidence, we might be able to take them down." Mark and I exchanged a determined glance. This was our chance to put an end to the nightmare once and for all. We agreed to infiltrate the hideout and get Jay whatever information we could. The next few days were a blur of preparation. We gathered equipment, formulated a plan, and steeled ourselves for the mission ahead. On the night of the operation, we made our way to the hideout, a dilapidated building on the outskirts of a desolate industrial park. We slipped inside under the cover of darkness, navigating through the maze of corridors and rooms. The air was thick with tension, every shadow and creak setting my nerves on edge. We finally reached a room that appeared to be a central hub filled with computers and surveillance equipment. Mark and I began downloading files and copying data, our hearts pounding in our chests. Suddenly the door slammed shut and the room was plunged into darkness. The sound of footsteps echoed around us, and a familiar voice filled the air. "Did you really think you could escape so easily?" The Dollmaker's voice sent chills down my spine. My heart raced as I frantically scanned the room for an exit, but the shadows seemed to close in, trapping us. Mark whispered, "Stay calm. We need to finish this." We continued copying the data, our hands shaking. The door Maker's presence was suffocating, his voice echoing around us. "You meddle in things beyond your comprehension," he hissed. "The Collective's reach is vast. You cannot stop us." Ignoring his taunts, I focused on the task at hand. We had to get this information out to expose the Collective and their sinister operations. As the last of the files were copied, the room grew colder, the shadows more oppressive. Suddenly the lights flickered back on, revealing the Dollmaker standing in the doorway, his mask gleaming in the dim light. He moved toward us with deliberate, menacing steps. Mark stood protectively in front of me, brandishing a small taser. "Stay back," he warned. The Dollmaker laughed, a chilling sound that reverberated through the room. "You think you can harm me? You have no idea what you're dealing with." Before he could make another move, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. Eclipse burst into the room, wielding a metal pipe run. They shouted, taking advantage of the distraction. Mark and I bolted for the or we raced down the corridor, the doll. Makers in rage shouts following us, we navigated the dark, twisting hallways, finally bursting out into the cold night. We didn't stop running until we reached our car. Mark jumped into the driver's seat and floored the gas pedal, speeding away. From the hideout, I glanced back, half expecting to see the doll maker pursuing us, but the road was empty. We drove in, silence, the gravity of what we had just escaped weighing heavily on us. Once we were far enough away, we pulled over to a secluded spot and began reviewing the data we had managed to copy. The files were a treasure trove of information, names, locations, communications, all pointing to a vast network of individuals connected to the collective. It was clear that the doll maker was just one of many operatives, each with their own twisted methods of instilling fear and suffering. We have enough to expose them, Mark said, his voice filled with determination. This ends. Now we spent the next few days meticulously organizing the data and preparing a comprehensive report. With Eclipse's help, we contacted the authorities, providing them with everything we had uncovered. They were initially skeptical, but the sheer volume and detail of the evidence convinced them to take action. A coordinated raid was launched on multiple locations across the country. News of the busts spread quickly, and the collective's network began to crumble. Many of their members were arrested, their dark operations brought to light. The doll maker, however, remained elusive, his whereabouts unknown. Despite the victory, a sense of unease lingered. The doll maker threat echoed in my mind, a reminder that he was still out there watching, waiting. Story 5. I was an exorcist in training. The plane ride to the Vatican was hell. Series. Previously, for an hour, maybe 2 after I called the Vatican, I sat on the front steps of the house, staring into space. Father Felipe was nowhere to be seen. I figured that was for the best. He'd probably taken Father Anthony's advice and run back to his church. With any luck, he was sleeping. I sat shaking on the steps. I reeked of blood and worse. Of course, I thought through the horror I'd just witnessed. The thick air, the smell of exposed guts, the glee on Maya's face as she slurped up Father Anthony's intestines. But that wasn't what dominated my thoughts. I'd seen her, Sophia, just as clearly as if she were still alive, warm and sitting beside me, teaching me to sew. Without question, she had been there. She had saved me. And so, I must have made an odd sight when the priests sent by the Vatican arrived. I sat there covered in several people's blood, including my own, my fingers bleeding from my clumsy needlework, smiling like I'd just seen God himself. "So good to find you well, Father Matthew," said a tall, muscular priest with a thick, grey beard. "I'm Father Thomas. This is my trainee, Father Anselmo." He gestured to a rail-thin, bald man with angular features beside him. "I thought I knew all of the exorcists working in the States," I said, still half dazed. He shook his head. "We are not ordinary exorcists," he explained. "We belong to a particular order, where discretion is of utmost importance. Still, we know rumors of our existence circulate. Perhaps you've heard of the Knights of St. Michael?" I shook my head. "Good," he said. "We are only called upon in cases requiring certain non-traditional skills. Based on your call, the Vatican believes this may be one such case." Father Anselmo shot him a look, and I recognized it immediately. It was one I'd given Father Anthony a dozen times when we arrived at the home of some poor girl claiming to be possessed, but really just needed a few years of therapy. Maybe some antipsychotic meds. "What?" I asked. "You don't believe me. What I saw?" "We're certain you saw something," said Father Thomas. "Whether you performed a common exorcism or encountered something greater remains in question." "Look at my fucking clothes," I shouted, staggering to my feet. "Look at the blood on my hands." "Smell me!" "Don't you smell it?" That's when I looked down at myself and realized I was clean. Not even a drop of blood decorated my robes. The only evidence of my encounter was a small scab on my index finger from where I'd pricked myself with the needle as I sewed Maya's mouth shut. I looked back at the house. Even the dark smeared window was clean now. with a gentle light shining out. Without another word, I ran back up the steps and opened the door. Inside, the house was pristine, almost unnaturally so. The blood was gone, the stink too. Somewhere, a vanilla candle was burning. Gentle music played on the speakers overhead. The girl, I said to no one in particular, and now I was running up the stairs 2 at a time again. I ran down the hall and burst into her room, half expecting to find her hanging from the ceiling by her feet, a mass of skin and sinew hanging from her mouth. Instead, I found her lying still, almost death-like in bed. She wore a spotless white dress, and her hair fell about her head on the pillow as if perfectly arranged strand by strand. She was beautiful now, no longer the creature of paper and bones I'd encountered hours earlier. The only evidence that anything had happened was the silver thread still in place, sealing her mouth shut. I heard the other priests approaching from behind me. "None of this is right," I said. "None of it was this way." "I believe you," said Father Thomas, putting a hand on my shoulder. "We have seen stranger things. The devil can be exceptionally tidy when he chooses to be. Or could it be that Father Matthew elected to perform a wholly unnecessary surgery?" said Father Anselmo, gesturing to the girl's lips. "We can pray that such is the case, for her sake," said Father Thomas. "In the meantime, we will proceed as if this is a true lieutenant of hell, likely of the third circle." I gave him a look. There were no such things as circles of hell in the canon. "Gluttony?" asked Father Anselmo, incredulous. "I thought they were supposed to be fat." Father Thomas shook his head. "Remember your Aquinas?" he said. "Gluttony takes 5 forms. Lauter, too luxurious. Studiose, too elaborate. Nimis, too large a quantity. Praepropere, eating at the wrong time. Ardenta, eating too fast. A glutton may be any size." I could tell Father Anselmo wanted to argue, but he was the trainee after all, and it wasn't becoming to argue, especially in front of a stranger. He bit his tongue. "Very well then," said Father Thomas. "Then we shall proceed. Prepare bindings of cloth soaked in holy water. Wrap her once at the shoulders, once at the wrists, once at the ankles. Father Matthew, if you are feeling up to the task, another set of hands would be useful, especially since time can be a factor in some cases. We will want to get her back to the Vatican as soon as possible. Before," as he spoke, I saw a hint of movement coming from the girl's direction. Glancing over, I saw something thick and black peek its head from between the 2 middle stitches of the mouth where the gap was greatest. It could have been a worm, a tongue, a snake, a centipede. Before I could get a good look, it pulled back inside. I helped Father Anselmo prepare the bindings, though I could tell he would have rather done the job himself. They'd brought holy water in some kind of red-brown earthenware jar that I hadn't seen before. We soaked 3 long strips of cloth and bound the girl, who didn't stir once. Though I had never heard of such a protocol before, the process made sense. 3 bindings representing the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit uniting to bind the demon. We were on a private plane bound for Rome. The aircraft was luxurious by any standard, with plush white leather chairs emblazoned with the flaming sword of Saint Michael in delicate black embroidery. 2 pilots sat up front, through a security door that looked extra thick. They'd made a point of letting me know they were both well armed. Of course, I wondered why such levels of protection were necessary, but I just nodded as if this was all perfectly normal. "Enjoying the accommodations?" asked Father Anselmo. Father Thomas had drifted off at takeoff, snoring loudly. Maya lay nearby in a seat they'd reclined to dorm a bed. "Father Anthony and I flew coach if we flew at all," I said. "Usually we drove." He scoffed. "I suppose you think yourself superior because of your humility?" "I never said any such thing," I said, but he was right. "You didn't need to," he said with a sneer. He cracked his knuckles and then scratched furiously at the back of his head. "You only reveal your own ignorance. We, the Knights of Saint Michael, are the very sword of God. One does not enter the battlefield on bended knee. supplicating to his opponent. He comes out in armor of gold, wielding a sword of fire, striking fear into the hearts of the demons. Now it was my turn to laugh. So the leather seats, that's the modern-day equivalent of a flaming sword. I'm sure they terrify the devil. Father Anselmo stood and stretched. He itched at his scalp again, furiously. I read about you on the way over, he said. A convert, widowed. You wear the robes, but you're different than those of us who grew up in the faith, who never knew a woman's touch. Before, I'd been slightly annoyed at Father Anselmo. Now, at the mention of my wife, I felt my blood rising. God comes to us all at different times, I said, quietly, but my hands were balled into fists. Save it for the flock, he said. We're all priests here. We should speak honestly. You and I. We're not the same. When my wife was in high school, she had a terrible boyfriend. He was an honor student and a top athlete. Popular, beloved. No one would have suspected the pain he inflicted on her in private. Even when we started dating, 10 years later, she couldn't describe what he'd done to her physically. In the dark of night, one summer alone in his family's cabin, no one for miles around. A fact he whispered to her over and over. All she would say is that a few days later, after praying the pain would go away on its own, that she'd driven herself to the doctor, who gave her stitches and promised not to tell her parents. Somehow, she couldn't break up with him. They continued dating through prom, even into the summer after senior year. She tried not to be alone with him, but it was futile. He hurt her again and again. When they finally broke up, there was no big confrontation. It was just the standard ending where they both went to college and drifted apart, eventually realizing they were no longer a couple. When they saw each other on holiday breaks, they acted friendly, even though his presence was enough to send her into a panic. After hearing the story, it occurred to me that I might have a moral obligation to find this man and hurt him as badly as he'd hurt her. Maybe to kill him, partly to spare any future women he might date from a similar fate. But if I'm being honest, it was mostly pure revenge. Naturally, Sophia was utterly opposed to such a thing. Maybe she wanted to protect me from the consequences of such a thing. More likely. She knew I wouldn't have a chance against him. He'd been an all-state wrestler and outweighed me by 20 pounds. Eventually, we came to a kind of agreement. I wouldn't seek the man out, but if I ever happened to bump into him in her, I was allowed to do whatever I wanted. For many years, whenever we visited her hometown, I felt a surge of adrenaline any time a man matching his description walked in the door of a restaurant. Is that him? I'd ask, and she'd shake her head no. Gradually, we visited Sophia's hometown less often. I never did see the man in person. As far as I know, I'd still have her permission to kill him if I ever bumped into him. You're right, I told Anselmo after a moment. We're not the same. And since we're going to be honest, maybe you'd be a better priest if you'd had a couple of rolls in the hay before you put on your collar, even just to know us sinners a little better. He was scratching harder than ever at the back of his head now. We're not the same. He was shouting now, so loud that Father Thomas began to stir in his seat. You didn't deserve to capture a lieutenant of hell. You got lucky. You weren't even properly trained. You just finished one last stitch. You're not even a real priest. He practically roared the last word. It had a strange echo, like it had been harmonized by two voices at once. As he spoke, he tore at the back of his skull again, and this time I heard a ripping sound, like flesh unzipping in two. Blood began to accumulate on his shoulders. Father Anselmo, said Father Thomas quietly, fully awake now. Please step to the side of the plane. Kneel. Fold your hands in prayer. I'll do no such thing. You meat-headed fuck, shouted Anselmo. It was clear that two voices were speaking in unison now, his and another deeper one emanating from the back of his skull. Suddenly, without warning, two things happened. Father Thomas began to say a Hail Mary in the original Latin, so fast that the words flowed together in a steady hum. Second, he pelted Father Anselmo with a jar of holy water that exploded as it collided with his chest, sending fragments of pottery and liquid everywhere. Behind me!" he shouted between recitations. I stepped back. As I did, the plane shook, and I nearly fell. The sky had been cloudless when we took off from LA. Now, dark thunderheads had gathered outside, blotting out the sun and pelting the small windows with rain. Father Anselmo had taken a step back after absorbing the force of the water jar. He also turned 180 degrees, revealing his back to us. There, I saw a bloody face no bigger than a baby's skull protruding just above where his neck met his hairline. The baby's contorted mouth shouted every syllable as Father Anselmo screamed. "There's nowhere to run to. Priest! You're trapped up here with me now. This time, you're mine." "Bifrons the Two-Faced," said Father Thomas. "I thought I recognized your—" Before he could say another word, Father Anselmo Bifrons now charged at him. I realized that in addition to the tiny head, he'd sprouted an extra set of arms and legs, which extended from his elbows and knees and had now grown almost as large as the original ones. The fresh limbs were bare and bloody, glossed with a sheen of mucus like a newborn baby. Father Bifrons fell on Father Thomas with full weight, beating at him with the bloody limbs and biting at his face with his fast-growing new head. But Father Thomas had been prepared. Pushing Anselmo to the side with one hand, he took a small silver blade in the other and stabbed it to the hilt into the baby head's right eye. The baby screamed a low growl that seemed to shake the very air inside the plane, and the aircraft dipped again, this time by 100 feet or more, tossing us all off our feet. When I looked back at Bifrons, his forehead was bleeding from falling against the edge of a chair. Ignoring the injury, he dug into his bag and removed 3 more knives. "Demon of greed," he said, gesturing to the demon. "Bifrons, we can contain him if we seal all 4 eyes. Try to stay back. Let me work." Even as he said it, though, I could see him wobbling on his feet. He touched his forehead, and the blood was gushing now. "Bad luck, Father Thomas," said Bifrons. "I suspect our next little conversation will be in my place." He charged at Father Thomas again, but the priest was ready, deftly. He stabbed 2 knives into the eyes that had once been Anselmo's. The demon howled in pain, so loud that my ears began to ring, and I fell to my knees. Outside, the clouds had fully blotted out the sun. Everything seemed to be shaking. I wondered if we were falling into the deep, black sea. Thomas fell back now, his head thwopping the ground with an unpleasant crack. He didn't open his eyes. Across the plain, the demon rose, fixing me in its one remaining eye. The lights shorted in the plane, and the engines went silent. Everything was black, save for the occasional flash of lightning. It seemed to me that I was about to die, or that perhaps I already had. Perhaps the rest of my existence would be like this, surrounded by darkness with the constant feeling of falling. A demon laughing a few feet away. Of course, fear gnawed at me, like a family of mice nibbling at my guts. But could I be blamed? Wouldn't anyone be afraid in such a moment? "Bad luck for you both," said the thing. "At least you'll finally be able to visit your dear wife again. Sophia, isn't it? I hear she's been missing you greatly." At the mention of Sophia's name, reality snapped back to focus. It was as if the plane was holding in mid-air. Gravity felt somehow lighter. I got to my feet, my fear replaced with simple, blind rage. Suddenly, the thing in front of me wasn't Bifron. It was Sophia's ex. I reached forward and uncurled the final blade from Father Anselmo's limp, bloody fingers. "I told you not to talk about my wife," I said. I could feel her there with me again. Silently, I asked if our deal was still on, if I could still kill him. I can't be sure, but I think I heard her whisper, "Yes." Now it was my turn to charge forward. My vision narrowed through the darkness. All I saw was the one cruel, white eye staring at me. I thought of my wife. Then I drove the blade home. On the tarmac in Rome, a man with red robes was waiting for us. I recognized him from a pamphlet I'd once read as Cardinal Robles. He reacted little as he surveyed the bloody scene. The pilot still hadn't left the cockpit. I suspected it was some sort of protocol. Father Thomas lay in my lap, his head bound with a pillowcase I'd fashioned into a makeshift bandage. Both Maya and Anselmo's bodies lay peacefully on the floor, her mouth sealed with thread, his eyes with daggers. After a moment, the cardinal began to laugh. "You'll have to forgive me, Father Matthew," he said. "It's not often that I send my men out to capture one demon, and they come back with two." I coughed up a bit of blood. I wondered when I'd been injured. I didn't feel like laughing. "Enough," he said. "I think we'd better get these two back home before a third one shows up. What do you say?" I nodded weakly. "We'll get these two to their new accommodations, and then we're going to have a nice long chat," said the cardinal. "I'm starting to think that Saint Michael has big plans for you." Story 6. I attended Bohemian Grove rituals a few years ago, and it's effed up. I always knew there was something rotten in Hollywood. The whispers of corruption, the sinister shadows cast by its brightest stars. But nothing could have prepared me for what lay beneath the glamorous facade. Fame, fortune, and critical acclaim were my companions. But with success came an invitation to a world so twisted, so horrifying, that it threatened to consume my very soul. Let me back up a bit. For safety purposes, I will briefly introduce myself without any names. I'm the director behind some of the most celebrated films of the past decade. I've had the privilege of working with the finest actors in the world, creating cinematic masterpieces that have captivated audiences globally. I've won an Oscar, basked in the glory of standing ovations at film festivals, and watched my name climb the heights of the Hollywood Hills, etched in gold. My movies have grossed millions, and my vision has shaped the modern landscape of film. To the outside world, I was living the dream, the very embodiment of success. Yet, even with all that acclaim, there was always a nagging feeling that there was more, something lurking beneath the surface of Hollywood's glitzy veneer. It started innocuously enough, a lavish party at a mansion in the Hollywood Hills, the kind of event where deals were made over champagne and caviar, where the elite mingled and smiled with practiced ease. But beneath the surface, there was a palpable tension, a current of something dark and primal. It was there that I first heard about Bohemian Grove. At first, it sounded like an exclusive retreat for the rich and powerful, a place where they could unwind, away from prying eyes. But the more I listened, the more I realized this was no ordinary gathering. There were hushed whispers about rituals, sacrifices, and pacts with dark forces. Intrigued and a little frightened, I accepted the invitation, not knowing that I was about to step into a nightmare. Bohemian Grove was nestled deep in the redwoods, far from civilization. As I arrived, I was struck by the sheer opulence of the place, but there was an undercurrent of dread, a sense that this place was steeped in ancient, malevolent power. The first night, I witnessed a spectacle that would be burned into my mind forever. Celebrities, politicians, and business magnates gathered around a massive bonfire. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood and something else, something metallic and sharp. The rituals began with chanting, a language that sent chills down my spine. And then the debasement started. Famous actors, the idols of millions, were stripped of their dignity. Public humiliation was the order of the night. I watched in horror as they debased themselves for the promise of more fame, more power. Some engaged in group sex on stage, their faces contorted in grotesque masks of pleasure and pain. Others ate feces, their eyes hollow and desperate. The worst were the sacrifices. I saw people kill their own family members in front of a cheering crowd. The bloodlust was palpable, a frenzy that fed on itself. I saw men and women allow themselves to be mutilated, their bodies violated with knives, broken bottles, and cigarettes, all for the promise of eternal fame. The boundaries between pleasure and pain, ecstasy and agony, blurred into a nightmarish tableau. But it was the supernatural occurrences that truly terrified me. Shadows moved on their own, whispers echoed in the dark, and figures flickered at the edges of my vision. At one point, I saw a woman levitate, her body writhing in the air as if possessed by a demonic force. I saw fires that burned with an unnatural intensity, casting flickering, eldritch light on the proceedings. The air itself seemed to pulse with malevolence.
A living thing that fed on the suffering and depravity.
Each time I attended the grove, it got worse. The rituals grew more grotesque, the supernatural phenomena more pronounced. I began to fear for my sanity, for my soul. The things I saw, the things I heard, no amount of fame or fortune was worth this descent into madness. One night, as I watched a particularly gruesome ritual, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was one of the high priests, his eyes glinting with a predatory intelligence. You could have all of this. You could be more than just a director. You could be a god. I recoiled, my stomach turning. No, I said, my voice trembling. I don't want any part of this. His smile was cold and knowing. Everyone has a price. He said, you just haven't found yours yet. I fled that night, vowing never to return, but I did. There's a particular night that stands out among the horrors I witnessed at Bohemian Grove. The air was thick with tension, an almost palpable electricity that set my nerves on edge. The usual debasements were already in full swing, but there was an added element of fear in the eyes of the participants. Something big was about to happen. The high priest stepped forward, raising his hands to silence the crowd. Tonight, he announced, his voice echoing through the dark forest. We honor the old ones with a ritual of ascension. A hush fell over the crowd as a group of young children was led to the center of the clearing. Their eyes were wide with terror, their small bodies trembling. The sight of them made my blood run cold. I had heard whispers of child sacrifices, but I had never believed them to be true. This was a line even the most depraved among us had never crossed. The children were placed in a circle around the bonfire, their hands bound with thick ropes. The chanting began, low and guttural, resonating deep within my chest. The high priest held a ceremonial dagger, its blade glinting in the firelight. As he approached the first child, a boy no older than 7, I felt a surge of nausea. No, I whispered, my voice lost in the growing chant. This can't be happening. The dagger descended, and the boy's scream pierced the night. Blood flowed freely, soaking into the ground, and the crowd erupted in a frenzy of cheers and jeers. One by one, the children were sacrificed, their innocent lives snuffed out for the sake of power and fame. The air grew thick with the stench of blood and burning flesh, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath my feet. As you can imagine, there were even worse things happening with the kids, things that Hollywood is known for. But for obvious reasons, I won't describe them in this Reddit post. But it wasn't over. As the last child's lifeless body was thrown into the fire, the chanting reached a fever pitch. The flames roared higher, their color shifting to an unnatural, sickly green. Shadows twisted and writhed within the fire, taking on monstrous forms. I saw faces in the flames, contorted with rage and hunger. The high priest turned to the crowd, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. Behold, he cried, the ascension is upon us. The ground split open with a deafening crack, and a darkness unlike anything I had ever seen poured forth. It was as if the very essence of evil had been unleashed. Figures emerged from the chasm, their forms shifting and melting like shadows given life. They were the old ones, the ancient gods of chaos and destruction. The crowd fell to their knees, their eyes wide with awe and terror. The old ones moved among them, touching their heads, their chests. Those they deemed worthy were consumed by the darkness, their screams echoing through the night. Those who were not simply vanished, their existence erased in an instant. I stood frozen, unable to move or look away. One of the old ones approached me, its eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. It reached out a hand, and I felt a coldness seep into my bones. For a moment, I saw my entire life laid out before me. Every choice, every mistake. And then it spoke, its voice a whisper in my mind. Run. The word snapped me out of my trance. I turned and fled, the sounds of the ritual fading behind me. I ran through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I didn't stop until I reached my car, throwing myself inside and speeding away from that cursed place. I never spoke of what I saw that night, but the memories haunt me. a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath Hollywood's glamorous surface. The price of fame is not measured in dollars or awards, but in souls, and some prices are too high to pay. Months after my last visit to Bohemian Grove, I tried to put it all behind me. I buried myself in work, hoping to drown out the memories with the mundane routines of directing. But the nightmares persisted, growing more vivid and more terrifying with each passing night. I was haunted by the faces of the children, their eyes pleading for mercy, and the unholy glow of the old ones. The nights were the worst. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of footsteps would echo through my house, slow and deliberate. Stopping just outside my bedroom door, I'd hear scratching on the walls, like claws trying to break through. Mirrors shattered inexplicably, their shards reflecting twisted versions of my own terrified face. One night, I woke to find blood dripping from the ceiling, pooling on the floor around my bed. I could hear whispers, disembodied voices speaking in that same guttural language from the grove. It felt like someone was always watching me. The worst was the sleep paralysis. I'd wake up unable to move, my body locked in place by an invisible force. My eyes would dart around the room, searching for the source of my terror, and then I'd see him, Satan, or something that looked like him. He was a towering figure wreathed in flames, his eyes burning with a hellish light. He'd lean over my bed, his breath hot and sulphurous against my face, whispering blasphemies and promises of power. The flames would lick at the edges of my vision, and I'd feel an intense heat searing my skin. When I finally managed to break free from the paralysis, the room would be ice cold, and the shadows would seem to dance with malevolent intent. During one of my research sessions, I stumbled upon an old Latin text that caught my attention. It was obscure and filled with cryptic passages, but one line stood out: Liberatus invitatio portis clausis apertis vinculis solutus erit. Roughly translated, it meant, he who invites will be freed, the gates will close, and the bonds will be broken. A glimmer of hope sparked within me. Was this the key to escaping the grove's grasp? If I could bring someone else into their fold, would they let me go? The very thought repulsed me, but the desire for freedom gnawed at my soul. Desperation drove me to consider the unthinkable. I knew I had to be strategic. The person I invited needed to be someone familiar yet distant enough not to suspect my motives. My mind turned to the world of music, a world just as dark and twisted as Hollywood. There was a rapper I had met through a mutual friend in the music industry, a short, black American hip-hop artist who was climbing the charts. We had crossed paths at various parties and backstages.
His name was becoming a household one.
The opportunity presented itself at a massive Hollywood party. The air was thick with the scent of expensive colognes, sweat, and the unmistakable aroma of cocaine. The night was a blur of neon lights and pulsating music. I spotted the rapper across the room, surrounded by a group of admirers, his laughter booming over the din. I approached him, drink in hand, and we quickly fell into easy conversation. The alcohol and drugs flowed freely, lowering our inhibitions. We reminisced about past encounters and shared stories of our respective industries. When the moment felt right, I leaned in closer. "Have you achieved everything you wanted?" I asked, my voice casual yet probing. "All the fame, the fortune, or do you feel like there's still more out there for you?" He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with ambition and curiosity. "There's always more," he said, a hint of a challenge in his tone. "Why, you got something in mind?" I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "There's a place, an exclusive retreat. It's called Bohemian Grove. Only the most powerful and influential get invited. You get in, and it's like nothing else. Your career will skyrocket." His interest was piqued, and I knew I had him. We spent the rest of the night celebrating, the promise of greater fame hanging in the air like a dark cloud. I arranged for his invitation, my hands trembling as I handed over the details to the high priest's contact. Weeks passed, and I waited in anxious anticipation. I knew the rapper had attended the Grove when I saw his face on every billboard and his name dominating the charts. His transformation was rapid and unsettling. he started engaging in increasingly bizarre behavior, mimicking Satan, showing off demonic signs, and covering himself in darkness and blood colors. His life became shrouded in death and Satanism, a clear sign that he had completed his initiation. For the first time in months, I slept peacefully. The nightmares ceased, and a weight lifted from my soul. I had done it. I was free. But the cost of my freedom weighed heavily on my conscience. I had condemned another to the horrors I had endured, all for my own salvation. One night, as I watched a news segment about the rapper's meteoric rise, a chill ran down my spine. His eyes, once filled with ambition, now held a darkness that mirrored the one I had escaped. I knew he was trapped, just as I had been, and there was no going back for him. I tried to tell myself that I had no choice, that it was him or me, but the guilt gnawed at me. I had become part of the very horror I sought to escape. The whispers of the grove, the haunting memories, they never truly left. They lingered in the shadows, a reminder of the darkness I had invited into my life and passed on to another. In the end, I could only hope that the rapper would find a way to survive, to escape as I did. But deep down, I knew the truth. The grove's grasp was relentless, and it would take much more than a simple invitation to break free from its chains. And as I turned off the television, the shadows in my room seemed to close in, a silent acknowledgement of the price we pay for our dreams. Edit, money and fame don't matter. I've had it all: Ferraris, Lamborghinis, huge villas, beautiful girls, and more money than I could ever spend. But why do you think all these celebrities turn to drugs, soulless sex, wild parties, and alcohol? It's because that's how they try to work out their trauma of what they had to do to get there. Behind the glamour and the flashing lights, there's a darkness that consumes. The price of fame is paid in nightmares and broken souls, and no amount of wealth or luxury can ever fill the void left by the horrors endured to achieve it. Story 7. I'm what you might call a shut-in. I've spent the past 5 years of my life shut off from the outside world in my tiny studio apartment. Other people might find it claustrophobic, but I find it comforting. This apartment is my world, and it's small enough that I know that I'm safe and protected from the chaotic world outside the window that I always keep closed and curtained. I wasn't always like this, though. I used to be a normal kid with a loving family. Then I lived in a fairly large house with my parents and older brother. I don't remember my parents very well. I know they loved my brother and I, but they were always too busy with work to actually spend much time with us. My brother, on the other hand, I can remember perfectly. He was a lot older than me, and more often than not had to be the one to take care of me when my parents worked late into the night. I've eaten his cooking more times than my mom's. He never seemed to mind taking care of me, though. Sometimes I wonder how much of that was a facade. A teenager like him must have felt frustrated, having to take care of his kid brother all the time. Thankfully, he was kind enough to never blame me for it, not overtly anyways. In return, I tried my best to not bother him or my parents as much as possible. I was a shy, quiet kid even back then anyways. I kept to myself both at school and at home, locking myself in my room until it was time to eat. In my mind, I was trying my best to not be a bother to anyone. Looking back, I think I might have come off as cold or uncaring to my family. Maybe if I'd tried to talk to them more, things would have gone differently. One night I woke up to the sound of my door handle rattling. I'd made it a habit to lock my doors early, one out of shyness, and that most likely saved my life. I got out of bed to open the door thinking that my brother needed something from me. But when I heard the person from the other side bang loudly on the door, I froze in my tracks. My brother was a calm, patient person. He never once raised his voice at me. It wasn't like him to bang on my door like that in the middle of the night. The person on the other side continued to bang on the door, getting louder and louder, with every passing second until I was afraid that it might break. All I could do was curl up in my bed under my blanket. At some point, I fell asleep and woke up the next morning, drenched in my own sweat. I tried to convince myself that it was just a dream, almost succeeded, too. But then I opened the door and stepped into my living room. What I saw there would haunt me for the rest of my life, even though I wasn't able to remember most of it. My court-appointed therapist tells me it's my mind repressing stressful memories that I wasn't mentally equipped enough to process. Yet, I can still recall some things though. I remember the blood flowing down the wooden floorboards. The metallic smell in the air reached into the back of my throat to make me gag. The red and blue glare of the police lights as they pulled up to the side of the house to respond to what they thought was a noise complaint. Those bits managed to sneak past the cracks of my psyche. Now they're pretty much the only thing I can remember about that old life. The repressed memories had extended to memories of my family in general. By the time I was released from the foster system and found my own apartment, I barely remembered anything about my family. Hell, I couldn't even remember my parents' faces at that point anymore. I became a shut-in, living cheaply off money I made doing freelance tech jobs online. Then, one day, I looked in the mirror and saw for the first time just how sad and pathetic I'd gotten, or rather, remained. 18 years old and I was still the same, scared little brat who hid under his blankets all those years. I thought that enough was enough and that I would overcome my fear. The therapist who I'd been talking to online told me that some gradual exposure therapy could help me overcome my fears. She was talking about my fears of the outside world then. Once I felt I was ready, she intended to take me for a walk outside to get used to the environment. But for once in my life, I wanted to do more than what was required of me. I was impatient after years of being trapped by my own mind, and wanted to take action while I still felt the determination to do so. That was the biggest mistake of my life. Instead of gradually exposing myself to the outside world to get used to it, I decided to confront my fear of death firsthand. And the only way to do that was to witness it. I logged onto the deep web using a Tor browser and over a dozen security features. I may be a shut-in, but I was also a freelance techie with more than one working brain cell. If I was really going to explore the deep web, I wasn't going to take any risks. I went to several gore sites to see people after accidents or natural disasters. A soldier, with his leg torn apart by an explosion, its bits scattered on the dirt around him. The site of a car crash where the driver has been crushed in their seat with their entrails spilling out of their eviscerated belly, and a person who'd been struck by lightning that fired their skin into a blackish blue hue with dark bulging veins beneath them. Some of the people in the pictures, I couldn't even tell whether they were dead or alive. It might have been more merciful had they been dead. I wanted to close the browser so many times while browsing that site. But even as the tears filled my eyes alongside memories that I'd been trying to forget, I kept clicking on links and looking at the terrible photos that popped up without averting my gaze. I was determined to let myself be scared by stuff like that anymore. It seemed like I was doing well. I hadn't curled up on the bed in a panic attack yet, at least. But then I clicked one link titled Family. Night Gone Wrong. I wasn't sure what I was expecting it to be about, but I thought it'd just be another gruesome photo. Instead, it redirected me to a video. I knew it couldn't be a live feed though. I had security programs that would block any attempt to sync my computer to another device. I might be a half-mad shut-in, but I'm not an idiot. The video showed the dimly lit living room of a house. Tied and propped up in a sitting position on the couch were middle-aged men and women with duct tape over their mouths. They were both sobbing through their closed mouths, but I could also hear another, younger voice sobbing with them from somewhere off camera. Two men in black ski masks walked into the frame and each stood behind the man and woman. They both gently rested a hand on the man and woman's shoulder, like they were giving them a reassuring pat after a rough day at work. The effect they had was anything but comforting, though. The man and woman started hyperventilating. The sobbing of the younger voice off-screen grew louder. Then, without warning, the masked men's resting hands tightened into a vice-like grip that made the man and woman visibly tense up in pain. The masked men pulled out switchblades from behind their backs and in one swift motion slit the throats of the man and woman at the same time. A muffled scream came from off-screen as the man and woman bled to death, unable to make any sound but the faint, involuntary wheezing of air squeezing out of their open throat. But that wasn't what broke me. What made me close the browser was what I saw when the camera panned off of the couch and focused on a teenage boy tied to a living room chair. I recognized that boy. He was my brother. That living room was my living room. The faces of the man and woman on the couch instantly became more familiar to me. They were my parents, and I was watching a recording of what happened in my house the night my life changed forever. I immediately called the police. The new evidence helped reignite the unsolved case of my family's murder. It's the only good thing that came out of my dark web trip. I've given up trying to overcome my fears of the outside world, at least for now. But maybe, just maybe, if the police can catch the men responsible for my family's murder, I'll be able to muster up the courage to go outside again. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.